Settle in and let yourself grow still, because tonight we are going to travel a very long way together. Not across any distance you could measure on a modern map, but backward through time, more than 1900 years, to a city that was then the warm and beating heart of the known world. And we are going to begin very gently, very slowly, the way all good journeys begin, with simply arriving somewhere and letting your eyes adjust to the light. And if these slow, unhurried stories are something you find yourself returning to, night after night, you might think about subscribing wherever you are listening, so that this quiet place is always easy to find again when the day has been long and sleep feels just out of reach. And if you feel moved to leave a small note in the comments, just a word or two about where in the world you are lying down tonight, know that somewhere out there, in other dark rooms, in other time zones, in other seasons entirely, other people are doing exactly the same thing, all of us drifting together toward the same soft shore. Now close your eyes if you like, and come with me. It is an evening in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and the city of Rome is settling into dusk the way a vast and very old creature settles into rest. Not all at once, not without sound, but with a gradual and layered quieting that takes its time, that moves from the outermost edges of the city inward, the way warmth moves inward from a fire. The sun has dropped behind the Janiculum hill to the west, and the sky above the Palatine is the color of cooling embers, orange giving way to a deep and dusty rose, rose giving way to the first pale gray violet of what will become a warm Roman night. The city you are arriving in holds perhaps 1 million souls, which is a number that would not be equaled again anywhere in Europe for more than 1,000 years. And yet in this particular hour, in this particular quality of light, it does not feel overwhelming. It feels strangely intimate. The great business of the day has mostly concluded. The forum, which all morning rang and clattered with advocates and traders, and the hard leather slap of sandals on ancient stone, has grown quieter now. The last of the vegetable sellers near the Circus Maximus are folding their stalls away, and the smell that rises from the warm stones of the street is a complicated and particular thing. Bread still faintly warm from the bakeries, the grassy sweetness of freshly watered garden soil, the mineral clarity of stone that has held all day's heat and is only now, very slowly, beginning to release it into the cooling air. There is the smell of pine resin too, because across the city, as the sky deepens, lamps are being lit, 1 by 1 and 2 by 2, small clay vessels filled with olive oil, from which a cotton wick draws flame upward into the dimming rooms of 100,000 homes. This is the lamplit world, and it is softer and more amber-toned than anything electric light has ever managed. It flickers very slightly with each movement of air, it casts shadows that breathe, and it smells faintly of the olive groves of Spain and North Africa and Greece, from which all this oil has come, carried in great clay amphorae on ships across the Mediterranean, which the Romans call, with unabashed confidence, our sea. On the Caelian Hill, one of Rome's 7 ancient hills, in a house that is prosperous without being ostentatious, a family is gathering for the evening meal. The house belongs, in the way that Roman family property tended to belong, to a lineage rather than a single person, the Anii Veri, a family of senatorial rank with origins in the Spanish province of Baetica. Though they have been Roman for generations now, thoroughly and completely Roman, the kind of family that produces consuls and administrators and men of careful judgment who serve the empire with a quiet sense of duty that never quite becomes ambition. The courtyard of this house holds a stone basin in which the day's last light is caught and slowly extinguished. Around its edges, rosemary grows in terracotta pots, and in the evening warmth, its scent is released gently into the air of the courtyard, clean, slightly medicinal, ancient. It is sometime in the 120th year of the Common Era, which is to say 120 years after the birth of Christ, 143 years after the death of Julius Caesar, and 83 years after the city burned under Nero. The emperor at this moment is Hadrian, who is at the height of his long reign, a man of extraordinary intelligence and restless curiosity, who has already traveled to nearly every province of his enormous empire, to Britain, where he has commissioned a great wall to be built across the northern wilderness, to Greece, which he loves almost more than Rome itself, to Egypt, where he is mourned beside the Nile. Rome in Hadrian's time is at its fullest extent, the largest it will ever be, an empire that stretches from the Scottish lowlands to the Mesopotamian plain, from the Saharan edge to the forests of the Danube, and at the center of all of it, this city, these hills, this deepening evening sky. Somewhere in this house on the Caelian hill, perhaps in a room just off the central courtyard, where the lamplight is settling into its evening steadiness, a child sleeps, or is being settled towards sleep, a small boy of perhaps 2 or 3 years old. Though we cannot be entirely certain of the precise details of those earliest days, only that he was here, that this was his world, that these were the first textures and smells and sounds that wrote themselves into whatever he was becoming. His name is Marcus Annius Verus, which is not yet a name that means anything to the wider world, which is not yet a name that senators know or poets invoke, which is simply the name of a child in a comfortable household on a warm Roman evening. What he would have heard in those first years, drifting in and out of early sleep, is the sound of a Roman city at night, and it is not entirely quiet, because a city of this size is never entirely quiet, even after dark. There are the voices of neighbors across the narrow alley, amplified oddly by the stone walls. There is the occasional roll and clatter of a cart. Because wheeled vehicles were largely banned from the streets during daylight hours, and so the delivery of goods and materials happened at night, the wooden wheels grinding over the irregular paving stones with a sound that carried surprisingly far. There are dogs, there is laughter from somewhere, and the smell of someone else's cooking fire, garlic, salt fish, the darkening sweetness of reduced wine, drifting through the shuttered window. And there is lamplight. This is what we return to, again and again in this story, the small and faithful flame of the oil lamp, which is not dramatic, which does not blaze or roar, but which simply persists, steady and amber and warm, holding back the dark by the smallest necessary margin. It was by lamplight that Rome conducted its evening life, its reading and writing and quiet conversation, its prayers and its small domestic rituals. It was by lamplight that the philosophers and tutors who would eventually shape young Marcus held their lessons, bending over wax tablets and papyrus scrolls in rooms that smelled of oil and ink and old stone. It was by lamplight many decades later that this same child, grown, burdened, gray at the temples, camped beside a cold northern river, would write down the private thoughts that still reach us across the centuries, still warm, still flickering, still lit by something we cannot entirely name. But that is all still very far away. Tonight, in the Caelian house, in the 120th year, the lamps are simply doing what lamps do, burning, breathing, casting their soft, particular light across the mosaic floor, across the sleeping form of a child who does not yet know what he will be asked to carry, who does not yet know anything beyond the smell of rosemary in the courtyard and the sound of the city settling into its warm and ancient night. Let that be enough for now. Let the city quiet around you. Let the lamp burn low, and rest in the knowledge that tomorrow evening we will come back to this house, to this family, and meet the boy more closely, his losses and his learning, the shape of the life that was already forming, quietly and without drama, in the ordinary days of a Roman childhood. For now, only this, the 7 hills at dusk, the lamps coming on one by one, and somewhere among them, a small flame that would burn for a very long time. Somewhere in the warm interior of a Roman house, early in the morning, before the city has fully roused itself, a small boy is sitting very still. He is perhaps 4 or 5 years old, dressed in the simple tunic of a child of good family, and he is watching a shaft of early light move slowly across the tiled floor of the courtyard, watching the way it catches the edge of a terracotta pot, the way it slides, almost imperceptibly, toward the roots of a small lemon tree growing in the corner. He does not appear to be bored. He does not appear to be waiting for anything in particular. He is simply watching, with a quality of attention that is unusual in a child so young, and perhaps even a little uncanny to anyone who happens to pass through and notice him there, in the slanted morning light. This is Marcus Annius Verus, born in the 121st year of the Common Era, on the 26th day of April, in a Rome that was, by most measures, as prosperous and orderly as it had ever been, or would ever be again. He was born into a family of Spanish origin, who had made themselves thoroughly Roman across several generations, patrician in bearing, senatorial in standing, comfortable in the quiet confidence of old money and old connections. His grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, had served 3 times as consul and held the position of city prefect, which is to say that he was a man of very considerable standing indeed, the kind of man whose name carried weight in the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was herself the daughter of wealth. Her family had made a fortune, it is said, in the brick trade, which may sound an unglamorous origin, but which meant, in practical terms, that she had grown up surrounded by educated people, fine things, and the particular luxury of not needing to worry about practical things at all. Into this world of cool colonnades and careful manners, of oil lamps lit at dusk, and slave-carried water basins, and the low murmur of educated conversation drifting through rooms smelling of cedar wood and warm stone, Marcus arrived as the only son of the family. He had a sister, Annia Cornificia Faustina, a little younger than him, and together they occupied the sheltered, orderly world of a prosperous Roman domestic household, which is to say a world of considerable comfort, threaded through with a kind of formal reserve, a world where children were loved, but also expected to become serious people in due time. His father, Marcus Annius Verus the Younger, was a praetor, not the most celebrated figure in the family's history, and one who did not linger long in it. He died when Marcus was very young, perhaps only 3 years old, which means that the father exists in Marcus's memory, if at all, only as something felt rather than seen, an absence that came too soon. The boy was raised from that early loss by his mother and his grandfather, and it is worth pausing a moment on what that loss might have meant, or rather what it did not mean, in the obvious dramatic sense, because Marcus himself, in the private writings he would one day set down by firelight in a campaign tent far to the north, does not speak of it with grief or complaint. He speaks of it, if anything, with the quiet equanimity that would become the most recognizable quality of his mind. He learned early, it seems, that loss is part of the texture of a life, that it neither destroys nor excuses, and that the correct response to grief is not to push it away, but to let it settle into one, like sediment settling in still water, until the water is clear again. His grandfather took him in formally after his father's death, and saw to his upbringing with the methodical care of a man who understood that children, like everything else worth having, require consistent attention. It is said that Marcus always remembered him with great warmth and gratitude, noting in those later private pages that it was from his grandfather that he first learned to be gentle and calm in his temper, not the performance of calmness, but the real article, the kind that comes from genuinely not being at war with the world around you. This is a thing worth noting, because the Rome into which Marcus was born was a place with a great deal of noise and ambition and friction, a city of nearly 1 million souls pressing up against one another across its 7 hills, and to move through it with any genuine tranquility required something more than good manners. The house in which Marcus spent much of his early childhood stood on the Caelian Hill, one of the 7, quieter than the Palatine with its imperial palaces, quieter too than the Aventine or the Esquiline with their dense neighborhoods of commerce and tenement life. The Caelian had about it a quality of residential composure, of wide streets and well-maintained gardens, and the particular hush that wealth can purchase even in the middle of a busy city. In such a house the rhythms of the day were orderly and predictable, the morning opening of shutters to let in the light and the sounds of the city below, the modest ceremony of the morning salutation by the household's clients, the careful domestic administration that kept everything running, and then the long middle hours of the day when lessons might be attended to, or the garden walked, or a book unrolled and read in the shade of whatever tree was casting the longest shadow. Marcus's mother, Domitia Lucilla, appears in his later recollections as a woman of uncommon goodness, generous, simple in her personal tastes despite her wealth, deeply pious in the traditional Roman sense. He would write of her that she taught him to be religious, but not superstitious, which is a fine distinction, and one that tells us something important about the household she maintained. It was one in which the old forms were observed without anxiety, in which gratitude was genuine and fear largely absent. She was also, by all accounts, a woman of some intellectual interest, a reader, a person who valued learning for its own sake, rather than merely as an ornament to social status. And this, too, left its mark on the boy who watched everything and said relatively little. because that is perhaps the most striking thing about what we can reconstruct of Marcus's early childhood, the quietness of it. He was not, as far as we can tell, a child who made a great impression through noisiness or physical boldness or the kind of competitive energy that Rome so often valued in its young men. He was mild, thoughtful, contained. He is said in sources whose reliability one holds gently to have been called not Marcus in the diminutive way of a child's nickname, but by the more serious form of his name, as though even those around him sensed that there was something in him that was already, in some way, grown. He loved, it is recorded, to hunt, though even in this he seems to have found pleasure more in the patience required, the stillness of waiting, the reading of animal and landscape, than in any particular violence of the conclusion. He wrestled, as Roman boys of his class did, and played at the sports that were considered suitable for the formation of a young body alongside a young mind. He wore the plain woolen cloak of a philosopher as a young boy, which is to say that someone, perhaps he himself, chose the garb of serious intellectual aspiration over the more fashionable alternatives available to a boy of his means. He slept, the story goes, on the floor sometimes, or on a very simple couch, as though already at an early age he was practicing something, training himself in the direction of whatever it was he half understood he was supposed to become. And through all of it, the house breathed around him, the smell of the garden in the evening, the sound of water in the small fountain at the courtyard center, the low voices of his mother and her household as the lamps were lit one by one against the coming dark. The oil would settle into the wick, the flame would steady itself, and somewhere in the deepening warmth of a Roman evening, a quiet boy would find his way towards sleep, having observed, as he always did, a great deal more than anyone noticed. The tutors who would sharpen that observant mind into something extraordinary were not yet in the house, but they were coming, and the boy who was already, in some wordless way, ready for them, slept quietly on a hill above the city, with the lamplight falling soft and steady in the room beyond his door. Somewhere in Rome, in the middle years of the 2nd century, a boy is sitting very still. He is perhaps 8 years old, perhaps 9, and the morning light is coming in at an angle through the open side of a colonnaded room, laying long pale rectangles across the floor. And the boy is not fidgeting, not looking toward the garden where a fountain makes its soft perpetual sound, but is instead watching the face of the man who is speaking to him, watching with the particular quality of attention that would one day become the thing people remembered most about him. The man is a grammarian, and he is speaking about the careful use of language, about the way a word can be made to carry more weight than it appears to hold. And the boy is listening as though the words are water, and he is learning, slowly and without urgency, how to drink. This is how the education of Marcus Aurelius began, not in a single revelatory moment, not with one brilliant teacher who changed everything in an afternoon, but in the long, patient accumulation of mornings like this one, room after room, voice after voice, the slow building of a mind that would one day astonish even itself with what it had quietly become. His grandfather, the elder Marcus Annius Verus, understood that a boy of this family required more than the ordinary Roman schooling, and so he arranged for tutors to come to the house rather than sending young Marcus out to the rougher, noisier world of a public school. This was not unusual among families of senatorial rank, but it was done here with particular care and seriousness. The tutors who arrived at the household were not merely adequate men, not simply credentialed and available, but were selected for their depth, their patience, and something harder to name, a kind of genuine love of the thing they taught, which is always, in any era, the quality that most reliably transfers itself from one mind to another. There was Euphorion, who taught Marcus his letters when he was very small, and of whom history has preserved almost nothing except the name, which is enough to remind us that behind every great mind there is usually someone utterly unremarked, who simply sat down with a child and began at the beginning. There was Alexander of Kotiaeum, a grammarian of some reputation, who helped Marcus find his footing in the Greek language and in Greek literature, leading him through the long, wandering worlds of Homer, teaching him to hear the music of the hexameter line, to feel the way the words themselves moved like water over stone. Marcus would later write of Alexander with affection, praising in him the quality of never correcting anyone sharply or with contempt, of offering a better formulation gently, as a suggestion rather than a rebuke. And we can hear in that praise the warmth of a student who was treated kindly and never forgot it. Then there was Fronto. Marcus Cornelius Fronto was, in the middle years of the 2nd century, considered by many to be the greatest Latin orator alive, a man who had argued cases in court with such skill and such music in his sentences that people wept not at the facts of the matter, but simply at the sound of his advocacy. He was a famous man, which is to say he was also a busy and rather vain man, but he took the young Marcus as a student, and something in the relationship softened him, because the letters that survived between them, and some do survive, fragmentary and warm, show a genuine tenderness on both sides, a teacher and student who became, in some meaningful sense, friends. Fronto tried to teach Marcus the art of eloquence, the Roman ideal of the orator as the highest human type, a man who could move assemblies and bend history with the careful architecture of his sentences. And Marcus learned what Fronto had to teach, learned it thoroughly enough to practice it when required. But something in him was already quietly looking elsewhere, already sensing that eloquence was a fine instrument, but not quite the one he was reaching for. Because by the time he was about 12 years old, and it is said by those who later wrote of his life that this is roughly when it happened, Marcus had begun to hear the voice of philosophy, and once he had heard it, nothing else would ever sound quite the same again. It is difficult now to convey how seriously Romans of this era could take philosophy, how it was understood not as an academic exercise but as a practice, a way of getting up in the morning and moving through the day, a set of tools for remaining a reasonable person in a world that was frequently unreasonable. The Stoic school in particular, which had come down through several centuries from its founders in Athens, and had been adopted with particular enthusiasm by Romans who liked its emphasis on duty and on the calm acceptance of things one could not change, had a kind of gravity about it, a settled, weathered usefulness, like a very old and well-made tool whose handle has been worn smooth by many careful hands. Marcus encountered this school through a man named Diognetus, who it is said was a painting teacher as well as a philosopher of sorts, and who introduced the boy to the idea that the examined life, the life in which one pays deliberate attention to one's own thoughts and motivations and works, slowly and without drama, to improve them, was the life most worth living. Diognetus is also credited, by Marcus himself in the opening pages of the Meditations, with encouraging him to sleep on a simple camp bed rather than a soft one, and to wear a rough cloak, and not to be distracted by the kinds of pleasures and small vanities that occupied so many well-off Roman boys. This was the beginning of something, the first quiet inkling that comfort was not the point, that the point was something further in, something harder to see and harder to reach. Then came Junius Rusticus, who was perhaps the most important of all. Rusticus was a Stoic philosopher and a man of genuine seriousness, and Marcus would later credit him with the gift of a copy of the lectures of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the most searching and demanding of all Stoic teachers, a man whose own hard life had given his philosophy a quality of tested truth that mere theory could never quite achieve. Reading Epictetus through the medium of Rusticus changed something in the young Marcus, shifted the ground beneath his feet in a way that he seems never to have tried to reverse. The idea that one's judgments, not the events of life, but the quality of one's response to those events, were the proper object of all one's effort and attention. This idea entered him like the slow, quiet beginning of a long season, and would continue to unfold in him for the rest of his life. There were other tutors too, a long gentle procession of them. Claudius Severus, who introduced Marcus to the peripatetic tradition, Apollonius of Chalcedon, a Stoic of austere reputation, who Marcus admired for his composed and unhurried bearing, Sextus of Chaeronea, the nephew, it is said, of the great Plutarch, who modeled for his student the combination of intellectual rigor and warm human affection. Marcus sat with each of them in turn, in rooms that smelled of parchment and lamp oil, in courtyards where the afternoon light moved slowly across the pale stone, in the particular quiet of a house where learning was treated as something serious and good. What emerged from all these years, all these voices, all these mornings of careful attention, was not a prodigy in the conventional sense, not a boy who dazzled with his quickness or won competitions, or made men shake their heads in theatrical amazement. What emerged was something rarer and perhaps more durable, a young man who had learned to be genuinely curious about the interior life, who had begun to understand that the work of becoming a good person was long and slow and never quite finished, and who had found in the Stoic tradition not a set of answers, but a set of tools, a way of asking the right questions of himself, again and again, with as much honesty as he could manage. And the lamp that his teachers lit in him, that quality of patient, serious, inward attention, would never quite go out. It would burn lower in difficult years, and higher in quieter ones, but it would always be there, somewhere in that composed face, those watching eyes, visible to anyone who knew to look for it. There are years still ahead of him now, whole long decades of a life being quietly prepared, and in the rooms of the house where he will soon grow from a boy into a young man. The fountain in the courtyard keeps making its soft sound in the evening. The lamp oil burns with its familiar warm smell, and somewhere across the city, in the great Hadrianic palace on the hill, an aging emperor has begun to hear certain things about a serious and attentive boy from a good family, and has begun perhaps to wonder. The afternoon light falls long and amber across the Palatine Hill, the way it does in the slow middle hours of Roman autumn, when the city seems to exhale and the marble of the great imperial buildings catches the sun at such an angle that everything appears to glow from within, rather than merely reflect. The fountains in the gardens up there make their endless soft sound, water folding over stone and pooling and turning, indifferent to emperors and senators and small boys who have been brought to pay their respects. And on such an afternoon, in the years when Hadrian was growing old and the empire was as vast and as settled as it would ever be, something quiet and unremarkable happened that would, in time, change the course of the world. Marcus was, it is generally thought, about 6 years old when he first came to the emperor's attention, though the exact moment is softened by time, and we cannot say with any certainty precisely when it was or what was said. What we do know is that Hadrian, that restless and brilliant and difficult man who had spent his reign traveling from one end of his empire to the other, cataloging and building and questioning, had come at last to rest in Rome, and was aging in the particular way of those whose minds have always moved faster than their bodies wished to go. He was somewhere in his 50s by this point. The great tours behind him, Hadrian's wall in the far northern province of Britannia already rising stone by stone, his enormous villa at Tibur already half a city unto itself. He was tired, perhaps, in the way that comes not from idleness, but from too much seeing. It is said that Hadrian noticed the boy at a religious ceremony, one of those formal occasions in which Roman family life and public life were so perfectly intertwined that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. Children were present at these things, expected to stand quietly and observe, learning by proximity the rituals that would one day belong to them. Marcus was there with his family, the Anii, a family of considerable standing and old respectability, and the boy apparently conducted himself with a composure and a seriousness that caught the emperor's eye. Hadrian was, by the accounts that have filtered down to us, genuinely fond of intelligence and sincerity in young people, perhaps because he had known so much flattery and performance from the adults around him. A child who did not perform, who was simply and honestly present, was something worth pausing over. Hadrian gave the boy a nickname. He called him Verus, which in Latin carries the sense of truest, or most genuine, a superlative form of the word for true. The story goes that this was not a polite or ceremonial gesture, but a real expression of the emperor's feeling about the child's character. Whether Hadrian already had in mind any plan for Marcus, or whether the affection was simply the affection of an intelligent older man for a promising child, we cannot entirely say. But the name stayed with Marcus into adulthood, and it is the kind of name that shapes a person as much as it describes them. Hadrian made Marcus a member of the priestly college of the Salii at around this time, or so the ancient sources suggest. This was a very old and very distinguished religious office, one of those Roman institutions wrapped in ceremonies so ancient that even the Romans of Hadrian's day did not entirely understand its origins. The Salii were priests of Mars, associated with the rituals of spring and the beginning of the military season, and membership was both an honor and a mark of serious expectation. That a boy of Marcus's age should be appointed was unusual enough to be noticed, and it told the people around him something about how the emperor regarded him, even if they could not yet see exactly where that regard might lead. The years passed as they do, with the particular slowness that childhood imposes and the particular speed that adulthood reveals in retrospect. Hadrian's health began to decline in earnest as Marcus moved through his early adolescence. The emperor had no children of his own, which had always been a problem that Roman political life required him to address, and which he had addressed with mixed results. He had designated a young man named Lucius Cionius Commodus as his heir, adopting him and giving him the name Lucius Aelius Caesar, but Lucius Aelius was himself not a well man, and in the first days of the year 138, Lucius Aelius died of a lung hemorrhage, leaving Hadrian without a designated successor, and in failing health himself. What happened next is one of those sequences of events that historians have turned over many times, trying to understand the reasoning behind it, and finding in it something that feels at once very Roman and very human. Hadrian chose as his new heir a man named Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a senator of excellent reputation and quiet temperament, a man in his 50s who had served with distinction and offended almost no one, which in Roman political life was an achievement of considerable subtlety. Antoninus was asked to adopt not only the dead Lucius Aelius's young son, a boy named Lucius, but also Marcus, who was then about 16 or 17 years old. Antoninus agreed, and Marcus was formally adopted, taking a new name, Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus, and finding himself suddenly and irrevocably repositioned in the world. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, in the quiet of this late hour, because the feeling of it must have been strange, and not entirely comprehensible, to a young man who had grown up in a warm and close-knit family, who had known loss, but also continuity, who had been educated in Stoic philosophy, and was already inclined toward the examined and inward life, to be suddenly made the son of one man by the decree of another, to understand that this was not merely a legal formality, but a statement about who would one day rule the known world, required a kind of inner adjustment that no amount of philosophical study could fully prepare you for. Hadrian's own motivations, as best we can reconstruct them, seem to have included genuine affection for Marcus and a real belief that the boy had the qualities required to lead. He is reported to have said something to the effect that he was pleased that Antoninus had the right material to work with in Marcus. Whether Hadrian also foresaw that Antoninus might reign for a long time, and that Marcus would have many years to mature before the weight of empire fell to him, we cannot know. But the structure he designed was an unusually thoughtful one, a succession that built in patience and preparation rather than demanding immediate readiness. Hadrian died in the summer of that same year, 138, at his villa in the coastal town of Baiae, where the warm southern sea made its soft sounds against the rocks. He was 62 years old, or thereabouts, and he had been emperor for 21 years. His death was not peaceful in the physical sense, for he had suffered greatly in his final months from what sounds like congestive heart failure, a slow and difficult diminishment for a man of such restless energy. But the succession he had arranged held. Antoninus became emperor, and Marcus became the emperor's son, and the machinery of Roman power turned with the particular smoothness that comes from careful preparation. For Marcus, whatever private feelings accompanied this enormous change, the life that followed would be shaped by the two great gifts Hadrian had inadvertently given him, time and a good father. Antoninus Pius, as history would come to call him, turned out to be exactly the kind of steady and unhurried presence that a thoughtful young man needed, and there would be decades ahead in which Marcus could watch and learn and write and think before the purple finally and inescapably fell to him alone. The fountains on the Palatine went on making their sound. The autumn light went on falling long and golden across the marble, and the boy called Verissimus, truest, went home to a new life that he had not sought and could not refuse, carrying with him, already, the habits of the interior life that would one day produce some of the most quietly remarkable pages any human being has ever written. The lamp in the Antonine household burned steadily through the evenings of those years, and it is toward that warm, unhurried light and the world it illuminated that our thoughts might gently drift as sleep draws near. The air at Lorium arrives before anything else. Before the color of the sky or the shape of the hills, it arrives as a particular softness, a mingling of warm stone and garden earth, and something faintly green and resinous, carried down from the pines that stood along the road from Rome toward the sea. This was the air that Marcus breathed in the years when he was becoming himself, the years before duty had a name or a weight, when the days were long and unhurried and the afternoons pooled like honey in the courtyards of the villa his family kept along the Via Aurelia, some 12 miles outside the city walls. Lorium was not a grand estate in the way that Roman grandeur announced itself. It was not a place of ostentatious colonnades or gardens engineered to impress visiting dignitaries, though it had its colonnades, and it had its gardens, and in time it would become the beloved retreat of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, who was not yet Marcus's father in these years, but would become so. The villa sat in a landscape that seems, even at this distance of centuries, to have been quietly beautiful. The coastal hills of Etruria rolling gently westward toward the sound of the Tyrrhenian Sea, the fields given over to olives and to vines, the sky in summer so blue and still, it might have been painted there by someone who wanted to demonstrate what rest looked like. It is said that Marcus spent much of his boyhood and his young manhood moving between this place and the family's house on the Caelian Hill in Rome, and if you wanted to understand the particular texture of his interior life, that quality of attention, that habit of turning inward, you might do worse than to spend some time in the silence of these two places, feeling how they shaped the hours they contained. In the Roman townhouse, which stood in one of the quieter quarters of the Caelian Hill, the light came in differently than it did at Lorium. Here it arrived through the compluvium, the open square in the atrium ceiling, falling in a column of brightness that moved with the slow turning of the day across the mosaic floor, touching first the threshold and then the basin of the impluvium, where water lay still and cool, and caught the reflections of passing clouds. Roman domestic life organized itself around this light, around the rhythms of morning salutations and afternoon quiet, and the gradual dimming that brought the household servants to their work of filling the lamps, small clay vessels and bronze stands that began to glow one by one as the daylight withdrew, until the house was filled with that particular amber warmth that Romans lived within for so many hours of their lives. The smell of lamp oil was the smell of civilized evening, the smell of reading and conversation, and the soft scratch of a stylus on a wax tablet, and Marcus would have known it from his earliest years as the smell of the hours he loved best. The garden of the townhouse was a contained world, not large, enclosed by the walls of the house on all sides, planted with the things that Romans planted in such spaces, low hedges of box clipped into gentle shapes, perhaps some rosemary and lavender releasing their oil into the warm air when a sleeve brushed past them, a small fountain whose sound was constant and unhurried, a sound that asked nothing of you and offered everything. In the afternoons, when the city outside went about its enormous business, the cries of vendors and the rumble of carts on stone and the distant overlap of 1,000 conversations, the garden absorbed all of that into a muffled distance, and what remained was the water and the bees and the slow movement of shadow across warm earth. A boy who spent his afternoons in such a place would learn, without being taught, that the world contains pockets of stillness, even when it is most in motion, that it is possible to be in the city and not entirely of it, that the mind has rooms it can close the door to. At Lorium, the stillness was of a different and larger kind. There the courtyards opened onto gardens that opened onto fields, and the fields extended to the tree line, and the tree line eventually gave way to the sound of wind moving through pines with that long exhalation, that oceanic breathing that seems to come from somewhere older than the trees themselves. The mornings at Lorium would have begun with birdsong while the sky was still pale, before the heat had gathered itself, when the dew was still present on the herbs and the stones of the garden paths were cool underfoot. Marcus mentions in the pages of his private writings that collection of thoughts and self-corrections that would come to be known as his meditations, that he owed to his grandfather the love of gentleness and of calm, and one imagines that calm as something absorbed not only from a person, but from a place, from precisely these long country mornings when there was no urgency, when the world offered itself slowly and asked only that you be present to receive it. The afternoon hours at the villa would have carried a different quality of light, thicker, more golden, the sun having worked its way into the warmth of the day so that the shadows beneath the stone pines were truly deep and the air above the garden paths shimmered faintly. It was the kind of afternoon that slows the breath, that makes reading a natural thing to do, that makes the space between one thought and the next feel comfortable rather than empty. We know from his own words that Marcus was reading philosophy from a young age, that the books which mattered most to him were not the fashionable rhetorical exercises his tutors also pressed upon him, but the older, quieter texts, the Stoics who had been writing for 4 centuries before his birth, men who believed that the good life was available to anyone willing to examine their own thinking with honesty and patience. In some room of the villa at Lorium, on some afternoon, whose exact date is lost entirely to us, it is easy to imagine the young Marcus sitting with such a book in his lap, while the lamplight of late afternoon came through a doorway, and the garden beyond was very still, and something in the words on the page matched something he had already felt without having words for it. The evenings at Lorium were long in summer, the sky refusing to fully darken until it seemed the night had to insist upon itself, pushing the last violet light below the line of hills with some effort. Small flames that did not diminish the stars so much as provide a warm foreground to them, and the household would gather in that particular Roman way that was formal without being stiff, affectionate without being demonstrative. The story goes that Marcus was always more comfortable in these quiet domestic evenings than in the formal ceremonies of public life. That the part of him which would one day reluctantly wear the purple of an emperor was already, in these boyhood years, most himself, when the world was small and warm and contained by lamplight and the sound of people he loved moving through nearby rooms. There is something in the layout of these 2 homes, the enclosed urban garden with its central water and its borrowed distance from the city, and the open Etrurian villa with its pines and its long views, that seems to have given Marcus something he would carry for the rest of his life and into the most difficult circumstances he would face. It was a capacity for interiority, a practiced ability to find wherever he happened to be the equivalent of that garden or that terrace, a small, still place inside his own attention, where the noise of the world became manageable, where it was possible to think clearly and to return to what mattered. He would need this capacity more than he could yet know. The years of quiet were not, as they might seem in retrospect, a prelude to the real business of his life. They were themselves a form of preparation, a slow filling up of something that would need to be drawn upon for decades. For now, though, the evening at Lorium is enough. The lamps burn steadily in the windless air. Somewhere in the garden the fountain continues its patient work, turning silence into sound, and then returning it. The hills beyond the villa are dark shapes against a sky beginning to show its stars, and the smell of the pines is carried on whatever breath of air the night has decided to send down from the tree line. Marcus, in whatever year this is still simply a boy in a house he loves, in the particular safety of an evening that has not yet ended. The darkness gentle and the lamplight warm, the pages of whatever he has been reading still open somewhere nearby. In the days and years ahead his world would begin to widen, not by his choosing, but by the choosing of powerful men who had noticed something in him. And the quiet of Lorium, like all quiet things, would come to seem more precious as it receded, a place he could return to in memory when the demands of an empire pressed upon him from every direction. The morning light came slowly to Rome in those years, unhurried and golden, spreading first across the high rooftops of the Palatine, and then sliding down into the colonnaded courtyards below, where the day's business had already begun in quiet murmur, long before the city's noisier quarters had fully stirred themselves from sleep. It was in this kind of morning, measured, calm, suffused with the particular golden quality that belongs to the early hours of a clear Mediterranean dawn, that Marcus Annius Verus, Now a young man of perhaps 19 or 20 summers would have found his way into the presence of the man he had been given to as a son, the man who would govern the known world for more than 2 decades, and who seemed in almost every way designed by nature itself to demonstrate what it might look like for a human being to hold great power without being diminished or distorted by it. Antoninus Pius was not a dramatic man. This in itself was a kind of gift, both to the empire he inherited and to the young Marcus who watched him so closely. He did not make sudden decisions. He did not fill rooms with the particular nervous energy that attaches itself to those who are uncertain of their authority. He moved through his days, it is said, with the steady and unhurried confidence of a man who had spent a long life determining what actually mattered and had arrived, in old age, at something very close to a settled answer. He was 60 years old when Marcus entered his household, formally as an adopted son, and the age difference between them was vast enough that what developed was perhaps less a relationship between equals and more something resembling the long, gentle slope of a master craftsman working with an apprentice whom he genuinely liked, showing rather than telling, demonstrating through the accumulation of ordinary days rather than through any single grand lesson delivered on a significant occasion. Marcus had already been shaped by excellent tutors, as you may remember from those earlier evenings we spent in his schoolrooms, but the education of the mind and the education of character are 2 separate endeavors, and Antoninus seems to have understood, perhaps without articulating it in so many words, that Marcus was in the process of receiving the second kind. He allowed Marcus to observe the way an emperor managed the enormous weight of correspondence that arrived every morning, the petitions and disputes and appeals from every corner of a world that stretched from the north of Britain to the edges of Mesopotamia. He did not hurry through this work with the impatience of a man who would rather be elsewhere. He read carefully. He considered. The story goes that he was known for the thoroughness and fairness of his replies, and that provincials who sent their complaints to the imperial palace often found themselves, to their surprise, receiving answers that suggested their words had genuinely been read, rather than filed away or handed to a secretary without examination. To watch this, day after day, year after year, was itself a kind of instruction. Marcus absorbed not just the content of what Antoninus decided, but the posture he brought to the work, the patience with repetition, the willingness to return again and again to essentially the same categories of human need and human conflict without growing weary or contemptuous. Later, in those private pages we will visit together in a later chapter, Marcus would write about the qualities he admired in Antoninus at considerable length, and the list is striking not for its mention of any extraordinary virtues, but for the attention it gives to ordinary ones: steadiness, modesty, the absence of vanity, the quiet persistence with which the old man did what needed to be done without requiring admiration for having done it. This is the portrait of a man whose greatest accomplishment may have been the difficulty of finding anything dramatic to say about him, which is, when you consider it, a rather remarkable thing for an emperor to achieve. The years moved like the slow seasonal change in a garden one tends but does not rush. Marcus would have been present in the Senate, learning the protocols and rhythms of that ancient institution, understanding how its members needed to be treated with a certain formal respect, even as the emperor's actual authority had long since eclipsed whatever real power the Senate had once possessed. He would have stood at Antoninus's side during the religious ceremonies that punctuated the Roman year, those long and carefully choreographed rituals performed on behalf of the whole world, in which incense rose in pale columns and the sound of flutes moved through temple courtyards, and the smell of sacrifice drifted across the crowded forum. He would have learned the geography of power not from maps but from the living texture of a day, from the way different people moved through the palace and what they needed when they arrived and what they carried with them when they left. He was also, during these years, a husband. His marriage to Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus himself, which made the domestic arrangement one of those peculiarly Roman constructions in which familial categories folded over one another in ways that are difficult to untangle, brought him a companion who would be at his side for nearly 3 decades, and the warmth of that partnership, the ordinary tenderness of it, will deserve its own quiet chapter in the nights ahead. Children came in those years, some of whom would live and some of whom would not, and the grief of those early losses settled into Marcus in ways that Stoic philosophy helped him to carry, but could not altogether dissolve, because he was, beneath the philosophy, a person who felt things, who allowed himself to feel things, even as he worked to prevent feeling from becoming a kind of tyranny over reason. There is a particular quality to the kind of learning that takes place across 2 decades rather than 2 years, and it is this: it teaches patience not as a concept, but as an experience, so that by the time the student is required to act, the patience has become constitutive of who he is, rather than something he must remember to practice. Marcus spent 23 years in the apprenticeship of watching Antoninus govern, before he was required to govern himself, and when the moment came, he would draw on depths of quiet endurance that only those long years of patient observation could have created. He was learning, without quite knowing it, how to wait, how to allow time to clarify what urgency only obscures, how to resist the pressure toward premature decision that comes when the weight of responsibility first descends, how to trust that many problems resolve themselves when approached with stillness rather than agitation. It is said that Marcus continued his philosophical studies all through these years, rising early to work on his thinking before the obligations of the imperial household called him away. The practice of waking in the cold, dark hours before dawn, to sit with one's own thoughts and the quiet scratch of a stylus, would become, over time, one of the defining images of his interior life. But in these middle years, the philosophy was still developing alongside the man, both of them slowly finding their shape. The Stoic framework that Epictetus had articulated, which Marcus had been introduced to as a young student, and which had immediately spoken to something deep in his nature, was being tested against lived experience now, rather than against the abstract propositions of the schoolroom, and the testing was producing not doubt, but a kind of slow, accumulating conviction. When Antoninus finally died, and it would not be until 161, when he was nearly 75 years old, a reign of extraordinary length and extraordinary ordinariness, completed with a composure that the sources tell us was quite consistent with the way he had lived the whole of it. Marcus was 40 years old, and had been waiting in the long educational shadow of that steady man for more than half his own life. He had not been impatient. This, too, the long years had taught him. In those last evenings of the apprenticeship, before the whole weight of the world rearranged itself upon different shoulders, the lamps in the palace rooms would have burned with their usual steady light, the smell of their oil familiar and warm, the small pools of golden radiance they cast upon scrolls and tablets, and the worn surfaces of reading tables, unchanged from all the evenings that had gone before. The light, as always, asked nothing. It simply continued, patient and persistent, illuminating what was near and allowing what was distant to remain for a little longer in the gentle dark. Soon the purple itself would need to be worn, and what came with it, both the weight and the unexpected grace of it, is waiting quietly in the next chapter for whenever you are ready to receive it. But for now, allow this particular evening to be enough. The courtyard cooling, the lamps steady, the old teacher and his patient student somewhere in the same building, breathing the same Roman air, and the long, warm work of those years not yet finished. The 7th of March, in the year 161 after the birth of Christ, came in quietly, the way most days of great consequence tend to arrive, without fanfare, without visible sign, the sun simply rising over the Tiber Valley as it had risen 10,000 times before, the river catching the light in its slow, indifferent way, the city below beginning to stir with the smell of wood smoke and bread, and the first footsteps of slaves on cold stone. Antoninus Pius had been unwell for some time. He was nearly 75 years old, which was itself a kind of miracle in a world where so few men reach such an age, and he had lived those years with the same unhurried steadiness that had marked his entire reign. 23 years of extraordinary, almost implausible peace, a reign so calm that later historians would struggle to find much to say about it, which is perhaps the highest praise any emperor could receive. He had eaten too much Alpine cheese at dinner, it is said, and had grown feverish over the following days, and those around him understood that the long, quiet chapter was drawing to its close. What happened in those final hours belongs to the small, tender category of historical moments that feel almost too intimate to repeat, and yet the story has come down to us, worn smooth by centuries of retelling. Antoninus, lying in his bed at Lorium, that same villa outside Rome, where Marcus had spent so many of his boyhood hours, where the fig trees grew in the courtyard, and the evening air carried the smell of warm earth, gave the watchword for the night to the officer of the guard. The watchword he chose was equanimity, and then he turned on his side, as though settling into sleep, and was gone. Marcus was 40 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades standing just behind the shoulder of power, watching, learning, absorbing the daily texture of governance with the patience of a man who understood that patience was itself a form of work. He had sat in council, had read dispatches, had observed the way Antoninus listened before he spoke, and spoke only as much as was necessary. He had waited, and the waiting had not been empty. It had been a kind of education more thorough than any tutor could have provided, a slow immersion in the actual weight of things, and now the weight was his. There is something worth resting with for a moment, something worth letting settle in the quiet of this late hour. Marcus did not want this. That is not a common thing to say of an emperor, and it is even less common for it to be true, but in his case the evidence is as clear as anything in the ancient world can be. He had been drawn toward philosophy from boyhood, had found his deepest satisfaction in the life of study and reflection, and had accepted the burden of power not because it gratified him, but because he believed, as his Stoic teachers had taught him, that a man must do what his nature and his circumstances require of him, however demanding, however far from what he might have chosen. Duty was not a pleasant thing, it was simply the thing, and so he accepted it. He accepted the purple robes that were brought to him, the formal acclamations, the careful ceremonies by which Rome transferred its enormous weight from one pair of shoulders to another. He accepted the title of Augustus, and with it the title of Pontifex Maximus, and with it the daily reality of governing an empire that stretched from the rain-gray shores of Britain to the sun-baked edges of Mesopotamia, from the olive groves of North Africa to the pine forests of the Danube Valley. An entity so vast that it required not imagination, but something closer to faith, simply to hold it in the mind all at once. But here is where Marcus did something that had never been done before in quite this way, something that speaks so clearly to his character that it shines across 20 centuries without diminishing. He insisted, firmly, immediately, without room for negotiation, that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus be elevated to share the imperial power equally alongside him. Lucius was his brother by adoption only, the son of that Lucius alias Caesar, whom Hadrian had first chosen as his successor before illness carried him away. He was some 8 years younger than Marcus, and in nearly every visible way his opposite, handsome in a fashionable, easy way, fond of pleasure and spectacle and the company of entertainers, a man who enjoyed the dames with genuine enthusiasm, rather than the dutiful tolerance Marcus brought to public occasions. He was not, by any obvious measure, a philosopher. He was not a man of deep interior life. He was warm, apparently, and good-natured, and genuinely attached to Marcus, and Marcus was genuinely attached to him, and perhaps that was enough of a foundation to build upon. What Marcus called him, in the formal language of the court, was co-emperor. What he meant, in the quieter language of his own heart, was perhaps something closer to brother, in the fullest and most generous sense of that word. Lucius was given the title of Augustus alongside Marcus, and given also the title of Verus, a name meaning true or genuine, and was sent in the years not long after their joint accession to command the armies in the east, where the Parthian Empire was pressing dangerously against Rome's borders. That he would go while Marcus remained in Rome to govern was a practical arrangement, but it was also, one senses, a kindness, an assignment of the role that suited Lucius better, the active campaign, the march and the siege, the visible glory of the military man, while Marcus remained at his correspondence and his counsels and his slow, careful attempt to be worthy of a position he had never sought. The early days of the joint reign were not, on their surface, catastrophic. The machinery of government was very old and very practiced, and it continued to turn. Marcus rose before dawn, as he had always done, the lamplight in his study, the quiet scratch of a stylus, the day organized around the discipline that had been his companion since boyhood. He received petitions. He corresponded with provincial governors and with the Senate. He attended to the 1,000 small decisions that accumulate around any center of power like leaves around a drain. He tried, always, to be fair, and there is good reason to believe he often was. But the empire into which he and Lucius stepped was not the tranquil empire of Antoninus's middle years. There were pressures building along the edges, like the slow stress in stone before a crack appears. Pressures on the Danube frontier in the north, where various Germanic and Sarmatian peoples had been restless for some time, and pressures in the east, where the Parthians under their king Vologases had moved against the kingdom of Armenia and were threatening to press further. The two new emperors had barely had time to settle into their new roles before the dispatches began arriving with the particular urgency of dispatches that cannot be answered with philosophy alone. Marcus read them by lamplight, as he read everything. The small, steady flame that had been his companion through all his years of study, now illuminating documents of war rather than pages of Epictetus. It is easy to imagine him sitting very still in those early evenings, the flame burning without flickering in the windless room, the reports spread before him, his face giving nothing away as he absorbed the slow and complicated truth that the world he was responsible for was larger and more dangerous than even his long apprenticeship had fully prepared him for. And yet he did not flinch. This is the quality that is perhaps most remarkable about Marcus, most worth holding gently in the mind as sleep approaches. Not his brilliance, not his philosophy, not even his famous goodness, but simply his willingness to remain present, to meet each day as it arrived, to carry the weight without putting it down, without drama, without the consolation of pretending it was lighter than it was. The lamps burned on in the palace. Lucius was somewhere in the city, dining with friends, laughing at something, living with his characteristic ease. And Marcus sat with his dispatches and his thoughts. Two emperors in one city, in one reign, in one improbable arrangement that Rome had never quite seen before, an arrangement that would hold, more or less, for the years ahead, though what those years would bring was still, in that first quiet season, mercifully hidden. Tomorrow there would be more decisions. There is a particular quality to lamplight when the world outside has grown uncertain. The flame itself does not change. It burns with the same small steadiness it always has. But the shadows it throws seem somehow deeper, and the circle of warmth it casts seems somehow more precious, more worth protecting when darkness has spread farther than usual beyond the walls. Marcus Aurelius would have known this quality well by the early years of the 160s, for the world beyond his lamp had grown very dark indeed, and the twin pressures of plague and war had settled upon the empire with a weight that no philosophy could simply think away, though philosophy, he was discovering, could help a man bear the bearing of it. The Parthian War had its origins in the East, in the old and always simmering tension between the Roman world and the Parthian kingdom beyond the Euphrates, those two great powers that had faced each other across that brown and ancient river for as long as anyone could remember. In the year 161, the very year that Marcus and Lucius Verus had assumed the purple together, the Parthian king Vologases IV moved against the Roman client kingdom of Armenia, installing his own candidate upon its throne and routing a Roman legion in a defeat that was, by Roman standards, deeply humiliating. It was the kind of news that arrived at the Palatine on a gray morning and settled over everything like ash. The dispatches passed from hand to hand, the faces of the advisors careful and grave, the maps unrolled upon tables and studied with the focused quiet of men who understand that lines drawn on vellum represent real rivers, real mountains, real thousands of soldiers whose lives depend on the decisions made in this room, in this lamplight, on this particular gray morning. Marcus sent Lucius Verus to command the Eastern campaign, and this decision tells us something careful and considered about the emperor, for Marcus himself remained in Rome, managing the vast machinery of empire, the courts and the grain supply, and the endless correspondence, while his co-emperor traveled east with a retinue of generals who were, in truth, the real military architects of what followed. Lucius was perhaps better suited to the visible theater of campaign life, to the banquets and the ceremonies and the symbolic weight of imperial presence, and Marcus understood this without bitterness, understood that ruling well sometimes means placing the right person in the right office, and then trusting the competent men around them to do the necessary work. The campaign that followed was, over several years, a Roman success. The capable general Avidius Cassius, a name that will come to mean something else in these stories later, pushed deep into Parthian territory, and the armies returned with prisoners and plunder and a renewed sense of Eastern order. But they brought something else home with them as well. Something invisible, something carried perhaps in the breath of a soldier, or on the surface of a shared cup of water, something that would prove far more devastating than any Parthian army. The plague arrived in the empire sometime around the year 165, though it is said it may have been encountered even earlier, during the eastern campaigns themselves, perhaps at the siege of Seleucia, perhaps among the close quarters of an army encamped along the Euphrates, where the air is heavy and the river smells of mud and distance. It moved westward with the returning soldiers, which is the terrible logic of such things, that the men who carry victory home also carry, unknowing, something far darker in their lungs and on their skin. By the time it reached Rome, and then spread outward through the provinces, it had become something the ancient world had not seen in living memory. A pestilence of true catastrophic proportion, moving through cities and countryside alike with a terrible impartiality, touching the slave and the senator, the soldier on the frontier and the baker in his shop, the mother beside her child's bed and the physician bending helplessly over his patient in the flickering light of a surgery that has run out of answers. The physician Galen, who was in Rome during those years and whose writings survive to give us some sense of what the illness was like, describes symptoms that suggest to later scholars something in the family of smallpox. The fever first, and then the rash, and then for many, the slow or swift dimming of the body's resistance, and the quiet or not so quiet ending that followed. It is estimated, though such estimates are necessarily uncertain when made across 2,000 years, that the plague killed perhaps 5 million people across the empire over the decades it persisted. And in some cities and some legionary camps the mortality was staggering. Whole units reduced, whole urban neighborhoods grown quiet in ways that had nothing to do with the hour or the season. Marcus watched this. He administered to it, organized responses, attended to the practical necessities of managing an empire whose population was quietly hemorrhaging, whose tax base was thinning, whose legions needed constantly to be replenished with men who had not yet served, and who would now be asked to fill the places of those the plague had taken. And in the evenings, in whatever room was available to him, in whatever small margin of quiet he could find between the dispatches and the audiences and the administrative decisions that fell upon him in an unending tide, he lit his lamp and he wrote. We cannot say with certainty exactly when Marcus began composing what we now call the Meditations, those extraordinary private notebooks that were never intended for any eye but his own, but it seems likely that the practice deepened and intensified during these years of pressure, that the twin catastrophes of plague and war gave the habit of philosophical self-examination a new urgency, a quality of necessity that it might not have had during the quieter years of his apprenticeship under Antoninus. When the world outside is genuinely difficult, when the problems arriving at your desk each morning are problems that cannot be fully solved, only managed, only endured, only carried forward with as much grace as a mortal man can muster, then the private conversation a man holds with himself about how to live, about what matters, about what he owes to others and to the universe, and to his own small struggling soul, becomes not just a luxury, but a necessity, takes on a weight and a relevance that makes it feel less like philosophical exercise and more like breathing. The pages he wrote are not organized, not polished, not arranged for a reader. They circle back on themselves, return to the same themes again and again as if he had not settled them the first time, which perhaps he had not, which perhaps no one ever does. Be present, he wrote to himself, in various ways, on various evenings. Do not be carried away by the impression of a thing. What is not good for the swarm is not good for the bee. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. He was not writing maxims for posterity, though posterity would receive them as such. He was writing reminders to himself, urgent and gentle in equal measure. The voice of a man who knew exactly what the Stoic philosophy taught, and who found again and again that knowing it and living it were two quite different kinds of work. That the knowing was easy, and the living was the labor of a lifetime. In the margins of these pages, between the thoughts about endurance and acceptance and the proper use of reason, one catches glimpses of the world outside the lamp, the sick city, the anxious advisors, the reports from the frontier, the children whose names appear in the record of Roman births and deaths with a frequency that must have cost him something, though he strove not to let grief become something larger than it needed to be. He wrote about loss without sentimentality, which does not mean he did not feel it, only that he believed feeling it at proper scale, neither amplified nor suppressed, was the goal of a rational man. The flame of his lamp would have guttered sometimes in a draught from the courtyard, throwing the shadows into brief motion across the wall, and he would have glanced up perhaps, steadied himself, and returned to the page. The plague continued, the frontier continued to demand attention, the letters came and went, and the private notebooks accumulated their quiet pages, a man talking to himself across the years, trying with the discipline of a philosopher, and the patience of an administrator, and the grief of a father, and the exhaustion of a general, simply to be worthy of the hours given to him. The next hours would carry him far from Rome, north toward a river that ran gray and cold, through a landscape nothing like the hills of his childhood, toward a frontier that would occupy the rest of his life. But for now, on this particular evening, the lamp burned on, and the pen moved across the page, and the city breathed outside the walls with its complicated suffering, ordinary life, and Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The river does not hurry. That is the first thing you notice, arriving at the Danube in the deep of winter. Not the cold, though the cold is extraordinary, settling into the wool of your cloak and the leather of your boots long before the sun has properly considered rising. Not the mud, though the mud is everywhere, that particular dark northern mud that has no equivalent in the sun-baked clay of Italy, a mud that smells of iron and old leaves and something older still beneath those things. No, the first thing you notice, if you stand at the edge of the camp in the gray hour before full dawn and simply listen, is that the river does not hurry. It moves with the slow, indifferent patience of something vast, something that was here long before the legions came with their timber and their measuring cords and their careful Roman sense of where one thing ought to end and another begin. The Danube slides past in the dark, iron-gray and wide, carrying its cargo of broken ice and silence, and it does not care at all that Rome has planted itself upon its southern bank. The sky above the camp lightens by degrees so gradual that you cannot catch the moment of change, only find yourself, at some point between one breath and the next, able to make out the shapes of the watchtowers, the line of the rampart, the slow movements of the sentries wrapped in their heavy cloaks, walking their rounds with the patient, head-down endurance that men learn when they have spent enough winters in this place. They walk and they breathe, and the fog of their breath rises and disappears, rises and disappears. A horse somewhere in the lines shifts its weight and blows softly through its nose. The camp begins, barely, imperceptibly, to wake. The fires are the center of everything on a morning like this. In each tent cluster, in each section of the great rectangular city that the legions construct wherever they pause long enough to call a place a camp, the fire is the reason men move at all. They feed it before they do anything else, before they lace their sandals or speak to one another, or think about the day ahead. They crouch over it, with their hands held flat above the flames, not speaking, faces reddened and then slowly, gratefully softened. The wood is never quite dry enough this far north, and it catches with reluctance and spits when it burns, releasing a bitter, resinous smoke that hangs in the cold air and drifts in slow curtains across the camp, so that the whole morning smells of fire, of pine, of the peculiar aromatic character of northern wood that is nothing at all like the clean cedar smoke of a Roman hypocaust or the oil lamps of the city. The smoke rises and spreads and mingles with the river mist, and the two become indistinguishable, the camp and the river breathing into each other. And for a long moment the world is simply gray and quiet, and smells of burning. The men who serve on this frontier are not the men of Rome's imagination, not the bright marble soldiers of the triumphal reliefs, their armor catching the Mediterranean sun. They are heavier men, rougher men, men whose equipment has been repaired so many times that it has lost any original character and become simply itself, a thing worn and mended and worn again. Their boots are wrapped in additional layers of leather and sometimes in cloth, against the cold. Their beards, which a stricter era would not have permitted, are grown out through the winter months, because the alternative is a razor in near-freezing water, and no sane man insists on that. They speak to one another in a Latin that has absorbed words from a dozen other languages, Pannonian words and Germanic words, and words from the eastern provinces whose origins no one could now trace. And this language is its own thing, the language of the frontier, practical and unpretty and perfectly suited to the life it serves. By the time the light has grown enough to call it morning, the smell of the camp has changed. To the wood smoke and river mud has been added the smell of grain cooking, of bread baking in the camp ovens, where the specialists have been at work since before even the sentries changed their watch. And something about that smell, grain, warmth, the fundamental human comfort of bread in the making, holds the cold at arm's length for just a moment. It moves through the camp the way good news moves, tent to tent, and men lift their heads and breathe it in and feel, perhaps, marginally more prepared to face the gray expanse of the day. The Danube is perhaps 200 paces from the camp's northern wall at this particular stretch of the frontier, close enough that you can hear it when the wind is right, a low sound that is not quite a whisper and not quite a rush but something in between, a sound that has no proper Latin name, because the Romans who wrote of rivers generally wrote of rivers under summer sun, where the sound was light and pleasant, not this deep winter murmur that seems to come from under the water as much as from the surface of it. The far bank is visible on clear days, a dark line of trees against a white sky, and the land beyond those trees is the land of the Marcomanni and the Quadi and the various peoples whose names the scribes were still learning to spell accurately after years of effort. On mornings like this morning, the far bank is simply absent, swallowed by fog, and the river seems to flow from nowhere and toward nowhere, and the world ends at its near edge. Patrols go out before the sun is fully established in the sky, small groups of men moving along the river bank, with the careful attentiveness of those who have learned that the difference between an ordinary morning and a consequential one is frequently a matter of a few seconds' notice. They move without speaking, their boots leaving prints in the soft mud of the bank that the river will eventually erase, as it erases everything along this edge, patiently, continuously, without particular urgency. A heron, improbably still amid all this military motion, stands at the water's margin and watches the soldiers pass and does not move, and one or two of the men glance at it sidelong as they walk, the way men far from home look at creatures that seem entirely at ease in places that feel to the men themselves entirely foreign. The afternoon on a winter's day at the Danube frontier is a short and colorless thing. The light never quite achieves the quality of proper daylight. It remains a lateral, hazy illumination that makes everything look slightly uncertain of itself. The tents and the towers and the wide flat terrain running back from the river to the south where the hills begin. The administrative work of the camp continues through these hours, the correspondence and the accounting and the endless small decisions that constitute the invisible work of keeping a large body of men provisioned and organized and pointed in the same general direction. Messengers arrive and messengers depart. Supply wagons come up the military road from the south with their precious cargo of grain and oil and vinegar and iron, the wagons caked in the same mud that cakes everything in this season, the oxen patient and enormous and steaming gently in the cold. And then the light begins to fail again, and it fails quickly here, much more quickly than it fails in Rome, where the city itself seems to hold the warmth of the sun for hours after it has dropped below the geniculum. Here the cold comes back with the dark, as if it has been waiting just beyond the firelight all day, and the fires are built up again, and the camp draws in around them, and the sounds of evening settle across the whole muddy, smoky, river-scented encampment. The low conversations of tired men, the horses moving in the lines, the river sliding past in the dark, exactly as it slid past in the morning, unmoved, unhurried, indifferent to the hour. Somewhere in the camp, in a tent somewhat larger than the others, a lamp is lit. It is a small lamp, a lamp that would be unremarkable in any house in Rome or Alexandria or any city of the empire, a lamp that burns olive oil with a small, steady, considerate flame. It is lit as the darkness comes fully down and the river disappears again into the night. By that lamp, a man is writing. The pages before him are not dispatches, not the official correspondence of the frontier, not the reports and requisitions that keep an empire moving. They are something else, something quieter and more private than any of that. The lamp burns on against the dark of the Danube night, and the river carries its ice southward in silence, and outside the tent the fires of 3 legions, make their own small and mortal answer to the dark. And it is enough, for now, to simply let the night be what it is. Tomorrow the campaigns will begin in earnest, the long marches north, the meetings with chieftains, the weight of command pressing down on the shoulders of the man who writes by lamplight. But that is tomorrow. For now, the river, the fires, the slow and patient dark. The river was there before he arrived, and it would be there long after the last legion had crossed back into the south, and the campfires had gone cold, and the grass had grown again over the places where men had stood in their thousands and breathed clouds of frost into the winter air. The Danube does not hurry. It moves through the wide flat lands of the north with a kind of geological patience, gray-green and unhurried, carrying its cold weight toward the sea, regardless of what empires rise or fall along its banks. And it was to this river, in the early years of what we now reckon as the 168th year after the birth of Christ, that Marcus Aurelius turned his face and began the long march away from everything he had loved about his life. He had not wanted war. That much is as certain as anything we know about the man. The Meditations, those private pages he wrote for no one but himself, are full of the language of endurance rather than conquest, of holding steady rather than advancing, of the patient lamp kept burning in the dark rather than the torch flung forward into the unknown. He had spent 20 years watching Antoninus Pius govern with a stillness that resembled wisdom, and he had absorbed from that long apprenticeship a deep and settled preference for the quiet work of administration, for the courtyard and the library, for the oil lamp burning low beside a page of Epictetus, rather than the signal fires blazing on a military ridge. And yet the frontier would not wait for a philosopher to finish his book. The pressures along the northern borders had been building for years, like water gathering behind a dam of reeds, and in the years following the Parthian War and the terrible passage of the plague through the empire's interior, the dam gave way. The Marcomanni, a Germanic people who had long occupied the lands just north of the Danube, in what we might now think of as Bohemia and the surrounding regions, crossed the river in force, pressing southward with an urgency that surprised even those who had been watching and warning. The Quadi, their neighbors and frequent allies, moved with them, and in a passage that the people of the time must have found almost incomprehensible, these northern peoples swept all the way through the Roman provinces of Pannonia and Noricum, and poured eventually down through the mountain passes into the northeastern corner of Italy itself, reaching the town of Aquileia, which had not seen an enemy at its gates in generations. The symbolic weight of that moment was enormous. Italy was inviolable in the Roman imagination, the sacred heartland, the origin of everything, and here was war pressing against it like a cold hand against a warm wall. Marcus had already been moving toward the frontier in those preceding years, feeling the pull of necessity even before the worst had come, and now there was no longer any question of where his life must be spent. He left Rome, that city of 7 hills and lamplight and familiar streets, and he did not know when or whether he would see it as his home again. He took with him Lucius Verus, his co-emperor and adoptive brother, and together they established themselves in the north, making the town of Aquileia itself the base from which they would coordinate the response to everything the river had sent against them. The preparations were enormous and absorbing. Marcus threw himself into the work of organizing, recruiting, supplying, strategizing, doing all of it with the same careful attention he brought to philosophical study, because he understood, as Stoic philosophy had taught him, that the task before one is always the task that matters, whatever form it happens to take. It is said that in these early years of the northern campaigns, Marcus sometimes walked among the legions in the evening, moving quietly through the rows of tents where the soldiers were cooking their suppers or repairing their equipment by the light of small fires, and that the men grew accustomed to the sight of their emperor present and unhurried among them, not performing inspection or delivering speeches, but simply there, inhabiting the same cold air, eating the same plain food, asking questions, and listening to the answers. Whether every detail of this picture is perfectly accurate, we cannot say with certainty, but it fits everything we know about the character of the man. He believed, deeply and practically, in the Stoic principle that one's position in life does not alter one's fundamental obligations, that the emperor in his purple is no different in kind from the soldier sharpening his spear. Both of them participants in the same brief human drama, both of them subject to the same cold mornings and the same final darkness. The campaigns themselves, in those first years of the Marcomannic Wars, were difficult in the way that frontier warfare is always difficult, grinding rather than spectacular, shaped by the terrain and the weather and the logistical complexity of keeping an army fed and supplied across enormous distances. The Danube Valley in late autumn becomes a landscape of extraordinary bleakness, the low hills fading into cloud, the river running dark between banks of pale mud and withered reed, the light failing early and returning reluctantly. And through this landscape Marcus moved with his army, establishing forts, pressing back across the river when conditions allowed, negotiating when negotiation seemed possible, fighting when it did not. The Marcomanni and Quadi were formidable opponents, not the disorganized tribes that Roman writers sometimes like to imagine when they wrote about northern peoples, but organized and experienced fighters who knew the ground far better than any Roman general, and who could dissolve back into the forests and marshes whenever the tactical situation turned against them. And yet Marcus pushed. He pushed carefully, methodically, without the theatrical boldness of a general trying to make history for its own sake, but with a steady and implacable intention that wore at the problem year by year. He was advised by experienced officers, and he listened to them, which is itself a form of wisdom that not all emperors have managed. He wrote letters constantly to Rome, to provincial governors, to officials managing the ongoing administrative complexities of an empire that did not pause its ordinary business simply because its emperor was standing in the mud of the Cannonian frontier. He sat in his tent in the evenings, with a lamp burning on the small table, and sometimes, in the hours after the correspondence was finished and before sleep came, he opened the private pages where he talked to himself in Greek and wrote down whatever the day had shown him about the nature of patience or duty or the correct response to frustration and difficulty. He missed Rome. It would be strange to imagine he did not. He missed the particular quality of the light on the hills in late afternoon, the smell of the city in summer, the sound of the fountains in the gardens he had loved, the sense of being surrounded by the accumulated beauty of centuries rather than the raw and temporary structures of a military encampment. But he had written to himself about this kind of longing, had warned himself against it with the gentle firmness of a man who knows his own weaknesses, had reminded himself again and again that the present place and the present task are always where one actually lives, that the mind which is always somewhere else is never truly anywhere at all. There were small mercies in those frontier years, small pleasures that became precious in the way that simple things do when the context around them is difficult. The quality of the dawn light on the river, seen from the camp walls before the day's business began, had its own strange beauty, the mist rising off the water and the far bank barely visible, the world suspended for a few minutes in a kind of grayish peace. The conversations with officers and philosophers who traveled with the army, because Marcus kept philosophers near him wherever he went, were a source of genuine sustenance. And the writing itself, the private practice of thinking on the page in the long evenings by lamplight, was not merely a record of suffering but an active discipline, a way of tending to the inner life even when the outer life was unrelenting and hard. The wars would go on for years, longer than anyone had hoped or predicted when the first legions marched north. And within those years, further griefs and complications would find their way to Marcus, as griefs and complications always do, arriving uninvited and requiring their own forms of patient response. The winter ahead on the Danube was cold and long, and the river kept moving in its slow gray way through all of it, indifferent and ancient, and carrying its quiet reflections of firelight on the current all the way down toward a distant sea. And somewhere on the road home from one campaign season, in a carriage moving through the cold northern air, Marcus would be called to face a loss closer than any battle, a grief that required no sword and admitted no strategy, only the steady lamp of a Stoic heart, still burning. The road from Aquileia runs southward through a landscape that holds its breath in winter, the flat plains stretching away on either side under skies the color of old pewter, the bare poplars standing in rows along the waterways like monks at evening prayer, their reflections trembling in the cold channels below. It was along a road very much like this one, sometime in the early weeks of the year we now call 169, that two emperors of Rome were traveling together in a carriage, and only one of them would complete the journey. You'd have been with Marcus through so much already, if you have been resting with these stories over the past evenings, through the courts of childhood and the long years of learning, through plague and the grinding machinery of frontier war. And now the road brings us to something quieter and more private than any of that, to the particular kind of sorrow that arrives without warning on an ordinary winter's day, the grief of losing someone you have known almost your entire life. Lucius Verus, his full name as emperor was Lucius Aurelius Verus, though he had been born Lucius Sionius Commodus, had come into Marcus's life as a kind of brother in circumstance, another young man deposited by the Emperor Hadrian's intricate arrangements into the household of Antoninus Pius, to be raised alongside Marcus in the same great house, to share the same lessons in the same pillared rooms. He was nearly 9 years younger than Marcus, and the story goes that Marcus had always regarded him with something of an elder brother's watchful affection, that curious mixture of protection and mild exasperation that elder siblings everywhere will recognize, even across the distance of 2,000 years. Where Marcus was careful and inward, Lucius was said to be easy and outward, fond of banquets and games and the golden warmth of good company. Ancient writers, not all of them generous, painted him as a man who enjoyed the pleasures of his position perhaps more thoroughly than its responsibilities, a man who, when sent east to manage the Parthian war, had relied heavily on capable generals while conducting himself, it is said, with considerable personal comfort in the cities of Syria and the East. We ought to hold these portraits lightly, as we always should when history has only the winners' voices to go on, but something in the contrast between the two emperors seems to have been real, and was probably visible even to those who knew them only from a distance. And yet, whatever their differences in temperament, Marcus had chosen to share his throne with Lucius from the very first hour of his reign, had refused the singular power that was offered to him, and had insisted on a co-regency unprecedented in Roman history, because he believed it was right. The two men had spent nearly 8 years governing together, corresponding across the distances the empire created between them, and Lucius had returned from the east with his victories, and had stood beside Marcus through the opening years of the Danubian troubles. They were bound together by something deeper than mere political arrangement. Lucius had also married Marcus's daughter, Lucilla, which made them fathers and sons-in-law to one another, as well as adoptive brothers, as well as co-emperors, an almost comically elaborate web of Roman familial connection that nonetheless seems to have been inhabited with genuine warmth. The winter of that year had brought the two of them together at Aquileia, the great city at the head of the Adriatic, where the roads from the north emptied out toward Italy, the city that sat at the hinge between the Roman heartland and everything beyond. They had been managing the frontier situation, the endless complex business of troop dispositions and diplomatic correspondence, and the feeding of armies, and now they were traveling south together, perhaps toward Rome, perhaps toward rest, moving through that quiet flat plain with its winter light and its cold waterways and the smell of frost on the fields. Somewhere along that road, Lucius fell ill. The ancient sources are not wholly in agreement about the details, as ancient sources so rarely are, but the broad shape of what happened is this. He was taken suddenly, some say with a fit of some kind, and within a very short number of days, 3 days some accounts say, though others are less precise, he was dead. He was 38 years old, or close to it. The exact cause will never be known to us, and speculation is perhaps less useful than simply sitting with the fact of it. A man relatively young, in a carriage on a winter road, and then gone. Marcus performed the rites that were required of him. He arranged for the body to be transported to Rome with the dignity befitting an emperor. He conducted himself, by all accounts, with that measured steadiness that had become the defining quality of his public bearing, the quality that his Stoic training had spent decades building into him, not the suppression of grief, which the Stoics did not actually counsel, but the ability to feel what is real without being swept away by it, to let sorrow exist alongside the continuing necessities of the world. What he felt privately, in whatever inner room he kept behind the ceremonial face of empire, we can only guess at from the scattered intimations in the pages he was writing. The meditations do not name Lucius directly in the way one might hope, do not give us a single passage where Marcus writes plainly of loss, but there are passages in those private pages that speak of impermanence with a weight that feels lived in, rather than merely philosophical, moments where the instruction to himself, to accept what cannot be changed, to hold lightly to the things the world can take, seems to carry the particular gravity of recent practice, rather than ancient theory. He dedicated temples. He oversaw Lucius's deification, a formal ceremony by which a dead emperor was declared divine, the smoke of offerings rising into the gray Roman winter sky. He managed the transition of governance with the efficiency that years of patient administration had made second nature. And then he was alone in a way he had not been since he had first ascended. The only emperor, the only one responsible for all of it. The correspondence and the judgments, and the armies, and the hungry petitions, and the endless complicated weight of the world's largest empire, pressing down on a single pair of shoulders. There is something to notice in how Marcus responded to this aloneness. And it is this: he did not retreat into it. He did not become smaller or more defended in the face of loss, compounded on loss. For the plague was still moving through the empire, and the frontier was still restless, and grief had been visiting his house in various forms for years by now. Instead, if the evidence of his writing and his governance can be trusted, he seems to have pressed gently further into the practice that had always sustained him, the daily returning to first principles, the quiet self-examination by whatever light was available, the willingness to begin again each morning with an honest accounting of where he stood and what was required. His daughter Lucilla was now a widow, young, and would need careful attention. The frontier would not wait for morning to conclude. The philosopher's correspondence, the legal cases, the practical management of an empire of many millions, all of it continued because it had to, because the nature of power is that it does not pause. And so Marcus carried on, not because he was made of stone, not because Stoicism had hollowed him of the capacity for feeling, but because carrying on was what he had always understood to be the work. The lamp in his study, wherever his study happened to be in those itinerant years of governance and campaign, continued to burn through the late hours. The pen continued to move across the wax or the parchment. The words continued to come, patient and self-questioning and alive. The road from Aquileia southward holds its winter quiet still, if you let your mind travel down it in the comfortable darkness of this evening. The poplars standing along the waterways, the flat fields going silver in the frost, the sound of wheels on stone, and the soft breath of horses. A carriage moving through a landscape that does not know or care what it carries, the road indifferent to emperors and philosophers alike, bearing them south through the cold air toward whatever comes next. There would be other roads, other frontiers, other necessary journeys, but that is for another evening's rest. For now, let the winter plain hold you gently. Let the lamplight of Marcus's ongoing life burn steadily in the middle distance of your imagination, and allow yourself to settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting tonight, the stories continuing to drift softly around you as you go. The road from the Danube frontier was always long, always dusty in summer, and treacherous with ice in the colder months, and Marcus had traveled it so many times by now that he knew its rhythms, almost the way a river knows the shape of its own bed, the way the land opens out as you move south and west, the way the air gradually loses its northern edge and begins to carry something softer, the faint memory of olive trees and baked stone, and the warm breath of the Mediterranean world. He had been living in the north for years, between the legionary camps and the river and the gray sky that seemed to press down on everything with a kind of patient indifference. And his body carried the weight of all those campaigns, the way old timber carries the memory of the tree it came from, deep in the grain, invisible but present, shaping everything. It was in the year 175, and Marcus was somewhere in the middle of his 50s, worn in the way that men are worn who have not rested properly in a long time, when the message came. News traveled across the empire by a system of relay riders and signal stations, that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably swift. And yet even so, the distance between the eastern provinces and the Danube frontier was vast enough that any message arriving there had already aged by the time it reached imperial hands, had already been overtaken by the events it described. And so it was that Marcus received the news of Avidius Cassius, not as a warning, but as something that had already become a fact of the world, a stone already dropped into still water, the ripples already spreading outward before he even knew the stone had fallen. Avidius Cassius, the general commanding the eastern legions, the man who had led the successful campaigns against Parthia in Marcus's name, the man who had governed Syria with what was by all accounts an iron and competent hand, this man had declared himself Emperor of Rome. It is said that when Marcus read the letter, or heard it read aloud to him in his campaign quarters, his first response was not rage and not fear, but something closer to a deep and tired sorrow, the sorrow of a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to understand what held human beings together and watching them again and again pull apart. The Meditations, those private pages he wrote for no one but himself, are full of passages that prepare a man for exactly this kind of betrayal, not because Marcus was cynical about human nature, but because he had thought carefully and honestly about what people were capable of, and had decided that even in the worst of it, there was something to be understood rather than merely condemned. Avidius Cassius was, by most accounts, a capable soldier and administrator. The story goes that he had received a letter, or perhaps a rumor carried imprecisely across great distances, suggesting that Marcus was gravely ill or perhaps already dead. The kind of garbled intelligence that the ancient world produced with some regularity, where an emperor's serious illness could be transmitted as news of his death before it had even resolved into either recovery or end. Whether Cassius genuinely believed the throne was empty, or whether he had been harboring ambitions that only needed a convenient excuse to surface, is something that even the historians closest to the period could not say with certainty. What is recorded, and what carries the particular quality of truth that rings quietly across centuries, is how Marcus chose to respond. He did not send a furious letter. He did not order immediate punitive action. He sat with the news the way he sat with most difficult things, turning it carefully, examining it from every angle, the way a man examines a stone he has picked up from a riverbed, feeling its weight, looking at its colors in the light. He called together those officers and advisors closest to him and spoke with them at length. He considered the practical realities, the distance, the logistics of moving an army across the full breadth of the empire, the effect that a prolonged civil conflict would have on the provinces and the people already worn thin by plague and war. And then he considered the moral weight of the thing, what it meant to hold power, what it meant to lose it, what kind of emperor he wished to be in the handling of a crisis that would reveal his character as surely as anything he had ever faced. It is said that Marcus expressed grief for Cassius, genuine grief, of a particular philosophical kind, because he felt that Cassius had damaged himself more than he had damaged Rome. A man who reaches for power through betrayal has already done something to his own soul that no external punishment can address. And Marcus, who had spent his entire philosophical life thinking about what it meant to live well, found something genuinely sorrowful in watching a capable man unmake himself in this way. He began preparing to march east. There was no avoiding the practical necessity of it. A claimed emperor could not simply be ignored, and the eastern legions would need to be brought back into order, one way or another. Marcus set about the preparations with the same steady, unhurried competence that he brought to everything, writing letters, making arrangements, speaking with Faustina, who was with him in the north and who prepared to make the journey at his side. And then the news came that Cassius was dead. The revolt had lasted, by most accounts, somewhere between 3 and 4 months, a remarkably short time for a rebellion that had, at least on paper, the resources and the military weight to become something far more serious. It is said that one of Cassius's own officers, perhaps recognizing that the revolt lacked the foundation of popular support it would need to survive, perhaps calculating the odds of facing Marcus Aurelius in the field and finding them unfavorable, turned on his general and ended the matter with a sword. The head of Cassius was sent toward Marcus as proof of the deed. It is recorded that Marcus did not want to see it. He ordered the head buried without ceremony, without display, without the kind of public triumph over a defeated enemy that many emperors before him would have staged with considerable enthusiasm. He was, by all indications, genuinely distressed by the manner of the ending, not because Cassius had been his friend exactly, but because he had wanted the man brought before him alive, not for punishment, or not primarily for punishment, but because Marcus had apparently composed, at least in his mind, something he wished to say to Cassius face to face. Something about forgiveness, it is thought. Something about the possibility of mercy being offered openly in public, as a demonstration of what kind of empire this was meant to be. He never got the chance to say it, and the loss of that moment seems to have weighed on him in the quiet way that unrealized things weigh on people who take the interior life seriously. The senators and provincial governors who had supported Cassius were dealt with leniently, remarkably so, by the standards of Roman imperial politics, where the suppression of a rebellion was often an opportunity for the settling of old scores and the elimination of political rivals under the convenient cover of treason charges. He is recorded as having said something to the effect that he would not allow his reign to be darkened by the execution of senators, and he carried through on this with a consistency that his contemporaries found unusual and that later admirers would find deeply characteristic. He traveled east anyway, moving through the eastern provinces with a deliberateness that served multiple purposes, reassuring the local populations, allowing those who had wavered in their loyalties to demonstrate their renewed commitment, and giving Marcus himself a chance to see the parts of the empire he had governed from a distance for so many years. Faustina was with him on this journey, and it is said that in certain quieter hours between the obligations of imperial travel, there was something almost like peace in it, the warmth of the eastern sun, so different from the gray frontier light he had been living under. The different quality of the air, the different sounds of the towns and roads. They moved through Asia Minor and Syria and into Egypt, and Marcus looked at all of it with the particular attention of a man who knows that looking carefully is itself a form of duty, a form of respect paid to the world and to the people who live in it. The lamps of the East burned differently than the lamps of the northern frontier. The oil was different, the evenings were warmer, and the darkness, when it came with a kind of fragrant heaviness that was nothing at all like the cold, clean dark of the Danube. Marcus sat with the light in the evenings, as he always did, and wrote, and thought, and let the long day settle into its rest. And somewhere in those pages, it is possible to imagine he wrote something about forgiveness, not as a gift to Cassius, who was beyond receiving anything, but as a note to himself, a reminder that mercy chosen freely is not weakness, but the highest exercise of the will, and that a man who holds power and chooses not to wield it cruelly has understood something essential about what power is actually for. The next part of the journey would take him closer to home, closer to the people who mattered most to him, to the quiet rooms and the familiar faces that waited somewhere behind all the distance and the duty. Somewhere between the clatter of dispatches and the long silences of a philosopher's evening, there existed a quieter Rome, a Rome of inner courtyards and low voices, of children's feet on warm stone, of a woman's laughter carried through an open doorway on a summer afternoon. It is in that softer light that we find Marcus Aurelius most human, most tender, most like any person who has ever loved someone and feared losing them. Her name was Annia Galeria Faustina, and she had been part of his life for nearly as long as he could remember. The story of their betrothal reaches back to the reign of Hadrian, when Marcus was still a boy being admired by emperors, still more interested in philosophy than in politics or matrimony. He had been engaged at first to the daughter of another man entirely, but when Antoninus Pius was adopted as heir, and Marcus was drawn into that new family constellation, everything shifted gently into a new arrangement. Faustina was Antoninus's daughter, and so she became Marcus's intended, a decision made by others, in the manner of the Roman world, and yet one that seems by all the evidence we can gather across the centuries to have grown into something genuinely warm and sustaining. They were married in the year 145, when Marcus was in his middle 20s and Faustina somewhat younger. The wedding itself is lost to us. We have no description of the day, no account of what was said or worn or felt. And so we are left only with what came after, which is to say, an entire life lived together. And that life, even glimpsed through the fragmentary record of an ancient world, holds within it something that feels unmistakably like love. They would have 13 children together, or thereabouts. The exact number is difficult to fix with certainty, as some names appear only briefly in the records and then vanish, as though the children themselves were candle flames briefly lit and quickly gone. It is said that not all of these children survived infancy, and indeed several did not survive even into childhood. In a world without the medicines and interventions we now take for granted, the death of children was a sorrow so commonplace that it had almost been woven into the texture of ordinary Roman life. And yet commonplace does not mean painless, and Marcus, who wrote in his private pages about the impermanence of all things, was surely not untouched by these losses. He lost sons, he lost daughters, he lost children whose names we know, and children whose names have not survived. The Meditations, that strange and beautiful document, speaks repeatedly of how we must not cling too tightly to those we love, how the Stoic must hold even the most precious things with an open hand. And one wonders, reading those passages alone in the quiet dark, whether he was writing them partly for himself, partly as a kind of interior discipline to help him bear what he had already borne. To know something philosophically and to feel it in the body are two very different things, and Marcus seems always to have been honest with himself about that distance. Among the children who did survive, the most prominent was the boy named Commodus, born in the year 161, the same year his father became emperor, as though the weight of the purple and the joy of new life arrived together in the same breath. There were daughters too, lived to adulthood, and were married into the fabric of Roman aristocratic life. Lucilla, the eldest daughter, was married to Lucius Verus, Marcus's co-emperor and adoptive brother, a union that bound the two most powerful men in the world even more closely together. The domestic and the political were never fully separate in Rome, and Marcus would have understood that better than most. And then there is Faustina herself, who deserves a moment of her own in the lamplight of this telling. History has not always been kind to her. Ancient sources, some of them hostile and some of them simply unreliable, circulated stories about her that were unflattering. Suggestions of impropriety, of infidelity, of intrigues that do not quite cohere when examined carefully. These accusations floated through the gossip of the ancient world the way such things always have, attached to powerful women, whose inner lives others felt entitled to imagine and condemn. What we can say with some confidence is that Marcus himself, in his Meditations, writes of Faustina with unmistakable tenderness and gratitude. He thanks her, in that strange and intimate accounting he made of the gifts the world had given him, for being affectionate and dutiful and simple in her way of living. These are the words of a man who has looked at the person sleeping beside him for 3 decades and found himself grateful. She traveled with him, which is itself a remarkable thing to hold in mind. When Marcus went to the eastern provinces in the early part of his reign, Faustina went too. When he spent years on the Danube frontier far from the warmth and civility of Rome, she was there, or nearby in the cities and camps that formed the administrative spine of those northern campaigns. She was given the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps, by the soldiers, a title that suggests she was not merely a distant consort, but a genuine presence in the world where Marcus labored. There is something quietly remarkable in imagining her there, in those cold northern places, so far from the marble and fountains of home, maintaining whatever warmth and orderliness she could bring to an existence defined by movement and duty. She died in the year 175, at a place called Halala in Cappadocia, which is to say in what we now call central Turkey, while she and Marcus were traveling in the eastern part of the empire. She had been unwell, or perhaps suddenly taken ill. The sources are not precise, and she died, it seems, quite quickly, which is perhaps its own kind of mercy, and perhaps also its own kind of grief, for there may have been no time to say everything that long-married people mean to say. She was in her late 40s, and they had been married for 30 years. Marcus requested that the Senate deify her, as was the custom for empresses of distinction, and she was duly declared a goddess, Diva Faustina, Divine Faustina, and coins were struck bearing her image, and a temple was dedicated in her honor in the Forum in Rome. These are the formal commemorations, the public gestures of a world that memorialized its great dead in marble and bronze. But the more personal memorial is in the Meditations, in that single line of gratitude so quietly placed among all the other accountings of his life, where she appears not as a goddess, but simply as a woman he loved. After her death he did not remarry, which under Roman law and custom he had no obligation to avoid, and which many emperors had done in far less time. He chose instead to take a companion, a woman who is sometimes referred to in the sources as a concubine, and it is said that he did this partly to avoid burdening his children with a stepmother, a consideration that feels entirely characteristic of the man who in all his writings returns again and again to his responsibilities to those around him. The children he loved remained with him through the remaining years of his life, present in his prayers and his worries and his philosophic reflections. He wrote that a good man should not be attached to outcomes he cannot control, and the outcomes of parenthood are almost entirely beyond control, no matter how carefully one tends to the garden of a child's becoming. He watched his son Commodus grow, tried to educate him, appointed him co-emperor in his final years, and perhaps hoped for something more than he received. We will come to that story in its own time, but tonight let it simply rest here. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, a philosopher who wrote about detachment and impermanence, also sat beside sick children in the night, also felt the particular silence of a house where someone beloved was no longer present, also turned over in his mind, as all of us do, the things he might have said or done differently. The great work of philosophy and the quiet work of love were not separate in his life. They braided together, one informing the other, through every year of his long and dutiful and genuinely feeling existence. In the distance, as that thought settles, you might imagine the small oil lamp on his writing table burning down to its last hour, casting a warm circle of light, just wide enough to hold the face of someone you love. That is perhaps the oldest image of all. The lamp kept burning so that no one has to sit entirely in the dark. And in the next chapter, we will draw a little closer to what he was writing beside that lamp, those private pages that were never meant to be read and have now been read by nearly every generation for 2,000 years. Somewhere beyond the leather walls of the tent, the Danube moved in darkness, carrying its cold northern water southward through reeds and silt and winter fog. Indifferent to emperors and armies, and the small lamp burning at a field table where a man was writing to no one at all. This is the heart of the thing, really. Not the campaigns, not the purple cloak, not the endless dispatches sealed with imperial wax and carried by riders into the night. The heart of Marcus Aurelius is a small lamp, a wax tablet or a roll of papyrus, and a hand moving across it in the quiet hours after the business of the world had, at last, released him. The words he wrote there were not meant for you, and they were not meant for me, and they were not meant for posterity or for the libraries of Alexandria, or for the careful hands of monks copying texts by candlelight in centuries he could never have imagined. They were written for himself alone, which is perhaps why they have lasted so long. We do not know precisely when he began. The story goes that the practice of private philosophical writing had been encouraged by his teachers, and the habit may have taken root in his younger years, in those slow afternoons at Lorium, or in the townhouse gardens where he would sit with a philosopher's text and a stylus and try to make the ideas his own through the physical act of setting them down. But the pages that survive, gathered together and given the title Meditations only by later hands, since Marcus himself left no title on them, perhaps no name, perhaps nothing to suggest they were ever meant to be found. Those pages carry in them the texture of a later life, a harder life. The sound of rivers and legions and plague and grief is somewhere underneath the sentences, felt rather than spoken of directly. What he called them, it is said, was something closer in Greek to ta eis hiauton, things addressed to himself, notes toward himself, a private accounting, and that is exactly what they feel like. They feel like a man in a room with a mirror, speaking carefully and without vanity, asking himself again and again whether he is living as he believes he should live, whether the philosophy he has carried since boyhood has taken any real root in him, or whether it remains only a beautiful arrangement of words. He was hard on himself in these pages. That is one of the first things a reader notices, and it is one of the most quietly moving things about them. that a man who held more power than almost any human being in the history of the world until that point should spend his private hours reproaching himself for impatience, for vanity, for the small daily failures that most powerful men never pause to consider at all. He reminds himself not to be irritable in the morning. He reminds himself that the people who frustrate him are not his enemies but his fellow human beings, made of the same matter, governed by the same uncertain reason, deserving of the same patient understanding. He reminds himself that he will die, and that this is not a frightening thought but a clarifying one, a thought that, held gently, makes the irritations of power seem very small, and the moments of genuine goodness seem very precious indeed. The philosophy beneath all of this was Stoicism, the school he had been introduced to as a teenager and had never really set aside, though he wore it quietly, without the theatrical austerity that some of his contemporaries associated with the name. The Stoics taught that the world is governed by a rational principle called variously logos, reason, providence, God, nature, and that a human being's highest task is to bring their own inner life into alignment with that larger order. What happens outside of us? Illness, loss, the behavior of difficult people, the flooding of a river, the dying of an empire's borders, none of it is truly within our control. What happens inside of us, the quality of our attention, the direction of our will, the words we choose in the dark, that, and only that, is ours entirely. Marcus returned to this idea again and again, not because he had mastered it, but because he had not. This is the thing to understand about the Meditations. They are not a record of Stoic achievement. They are a record of Stoic struggle. He is not writing from the summit of wisdom, but from somewhere on the long slope, tired, looking up, reminding himself that the climb is worth continuing. He writes about anger and catches himself still feeling it. He writes about the unimportance of reputation and admits in the very same passage that he still cares about what people think of him. He writes about the brevity of life and then has to write it again the next day because yesterday's reminder has already grown faint. There is a passage, one of the most often returned to, one of the most quietly devastating in the whole small book, where he reflects on the emperors who came before him, the great and celebrated men whose names once filled rooms and whose deeds were on the lips of the entire world, and he observes that they are gone, all of them, and mostly forgotten, and that the same will be true of him, and that this is perfectly all right. He does not say it with despair. He says it the way you might set down a heavy thing you had been carrying unnecessarily, with relief even, and a kind of loosening in the shoulders. The world turns, the generations pass, the lamp goes out in one room and is lit in another. What matters is only what you do with the light while it is burning. He was drawn to the physical facts of existence, to the reminder that the most magnificent things are, at their root, made of the same stuff as the humblest. Purple dye, he notes somewhere, is dried blood and shellfish. Imperial bread is grain and salt and water. The great ceremonies of state are costumes and movement and arranged noise. He is not saying these things to diminish them, but to see them clearly, to look at the gilded surface of power and perceive the simple, common materials underneath, so that neither the gilding nor its absence can deceive him. And then there is love. It is quieter in these pages than the philosophy, but it is there. He writes of his teachers with a gratitude so particular and so specific that you can almost see each one of them, the bearing of one, the restraint of another, the patience of a third. He writes of Antoninus, his adoptive father, with something approaching reverence, cataloging the older man's virtues the way someone might sort through small, personal bronze of a costume, precious stones after a person they have loved has died and left them behind. He writes of the importance of human fellowship, of the bonds that hold civilized life together, of the duty owed not just to Rome, but to the whole human race, which he understood, following the Stoics who came before him, as a single community, regardless of the accident of where any individual had happened to be born. This idea that all of us belong to one another, that the Marcomanni on the other side of the Danube are not a lesser species, but a different arrangement of the same matter and reason. This idea sat at the center of his private world, even as the business of ruling required him to send legions against those same people. He did not seem to find this contradiction comfortable, and he did not pretend to resolve it neatly. He held it, the way one holds a stone that is both heavy and warm. because setting it down entirely did not seem honest. The Greek in which he wrote is not the polished Greek of literary ambition. It is a working Greek, a thinking Greek, the language of a man using words as a tool for getting at something true, rather than as a performance of elegance. And this plainness is part of what makes the pages feel so close, so present. Even across the enormous distance of nearly 2,000 years, you can hear him thinking. You can hear the stylus moving, and the lamp burning, and the river in the darkness beyond the tent wall, and the occasional sound of a soldier passing outside, and then the silence settling again as he finds the next word. He never finished. No final chapter, no conclusion, no sense that he arrived at the peace he was reaching toward. The notes simply continue, and then somewhere they stop, which is perhaps the most honest ending such a book could have. A life's work not completed but lived. A conversation with the self not concluded but carried on until the voice grew quiet. And in the quiet after he set down the stylus for the last time, in some evening's lamplight, the river went on turning its cold water southward through the night. The same river it had always been, carrying everything downstream and onward into the wider world, as it would carry him too, and his words, and the small flame of that tent lamp, gently, gently, into the long dark that was also, in its way, a kind of rest. In the chapters still ahead, we will walk beside him on the road, back to the northern frontier, older now, the cold in his bones, the pages still open beside him as he travels. But that is a journey for another quiet night, and for now, there is only the lamp and the river, and the stillness between one word and the next. The road north begins before the city has properly woken. In that soft gray hour when the hills of Rome are still wrapped in the last of the night, and the lamps along the Via Flaminia have not yet been extinguished by their keepers, their flames holding on against the fading dark like small warm arguments against the coming of the cold. The wagons are loaded, and the horses are breathing steam into the morning air, and somewhere behind him, receding now with every slow turn of the wheels, the 7 hills are disappearing into the haze that always gathers over the Tiber at this hour. That soft amber smudging of the city's edges that Marcus had known since childhood, since the mornings when he was a boy in his grandfather's house, and the lamplight spilled out across the courtyard stones, and Rome smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the river running somewhere not far below. He is 57 years old as he makes this journey north for the last time, though neither he nor anyone around him knows with certainty that it will be the last. His body has been telling him things for years now, quietly at first, and then with increasing insistence. The way a river begins to speak louder as it approaches a change in the landscape, a narrowing, a shallowing, some alteration up ahead that the water can sense before the eye can see it. He has suffered through illnesses that came and went without fully departing, leaving behind them a residue of weariness that does not lift as it once did. His chest troubles him. His sleep is fitful. The physicians who travel with the imperial party watch him with the careful, practiced attention of men who know what they know, and are not yet ready to say it aloud. And Marcus, who has written in his private pages that the body is a thing borrowed and never truly owned, bears all of this with the slow patience of someone who has been practicing for a very long time. The world through which he travels is familiar to him by now, in the way that long-known grief is familiar. Not comfortable exactly, but possessed of a certain recognizable shape that no longer surprises. He has made this journey before, more than once, the long pull-up through northern Italy and across the mountains, and then down again into the provinces beyond, the land growing gradually quieter and greener, and more insistently itself the farther one travels from Rome, as though the empire thins at its edges into something more elemental, more indifferent to human arrangement. The alpine passes are cold in this season. The snow along the higher ridges does not melt but simply shifts and resettles with each new wind that comes down off the peaks. And the soldiers in the column pull their cloaks tighter and say less than they would have said in summer, and the whole procession moves through the mountains in a hush that Marcus finds, if he is honest with himself, not unpleasant. He writes during the journey when he can. The carriage is not comfortable for writing, no carriage is, but he has long since learned to make do with imperfect conditions. to find the still point inside the rattling and the jolting and the noise of an army on the move. He has a small lamp that the servants keep lit for him when the light outside is not enough. And in its flame, which trembles with each rut in the road, but does not go out, he finds something like the steadiness he is reaching for in the words themselves. He writes about distraction, about the pull of the senses toward things that do not matter, about the discipline of returning, always returning, to what is actually present and real. He writes these things, not because he has mastered them, but because he has not. And the writing is itself a form of practice, a daily return to the beginning. The way a musician runs through the same exercises, not because they are new, but because the hands require repetition to remember what the mind already knows. The countryside opens out as the mountains fall away behind, and there is a particular afternoon somewhere in the province of Noricum, when the sky does something extraordinary. It clears without warning after days of low cloud, and the light comes through with that particular quality of late-season light in northern places, horizontal and golden and almost grieving in its beauty, lying across the fields and the dark tree lines in long, slow bands that make everything seem both intensely present and already passing. Marcus watches this from the window of his carriage for a long time. It is said that he kept a list of things for which he was grateful. People who had taught him patience, people who had shown him kindness, small and large gifts that the world had pressed into his hands without being asked. Perhaps on this afternoon he added something like this light, this particular falling of gold across an ordinary field in a province far from home, which cost nothing and was gone in half an hour, and which he would, in all likelihood, never see again in quite the same way. The Danube appears to him first as a sound, as it always does on this approach, a low, continuous presence in the air before the river itself becomes visible, a murmur that is not quite a murmur and not quite a roar, but something between the two, something that has been making the same sound for longer than any human memory can reach. Then the smell of it, cold and green and mineral, the smell of deep water and distance, of mountains that have been melting somewhere far to the east and sending their cold self southward through all this gray landscape. And then finally the river itself, wide and brown and moving with that slow, irresistible certainty that Marcus has written about in his private pages. The river as an image of impermanence, of the way everything flows and nothing remains precisely as it was, and yet the river is always and undeniably there, present, constant in its flowing, even as it is never twice the same water. The camp at the frontier is established and familiar by now, the layout of it known to his body even before his eyes have taken it in. The praetorium, the tent of the officers, the smell of cook fires and horses and wet earth, the sound of the legions settling into their routines as the evening comes down. He is greeted by his generals with the respectful formality of men who are genuinely glad to see him, who have been managing without him and would rather not have had to. There are reports to receive, assessments to be made, decisions that have been waiting for his judgment. He attends to all of it with the unhurried attention that has always been his way, and the officers who have served with him for years have learned to read in this slowness, not indifference, but a kind of absolute presence, a quality of being entirely here, that most men cannot maintain for more than a few minutes at a time. Later, when the lamp is lit in his tent, and the camp has grown quiet around him, the distant low sounds of the river always present beneath everything else, a kind of ground note against which all other sounds resolve. He opens his writing again. He is not in these pages an emperor. He is not a general or a Stoic philosopher, or a man whose words will be read by people who have not yet been born. He is only a man talking to himself in the most honest voice he can find, asking himself the same questions he has always asked, measuring the distance between who he is and who he believes it is possible to be. The lamp burns. The river moves in the darkness beyond the walls. The stars, when he steps briefly outside to look, are very bright in this clear northern air, much brighter than they ever are above Rome, where the city's own 1,000 lamps wash them faint and distant. He stands there for a moment in the cold, an older man than the one who first came north, a wearier one, but still looking up with something recognizable in his expression. Attention, that word he returns to again and again in his writing, the willingness to look carefully at whatever is actually here. The river is here, the cold is here, the stars are here, astonishing in their number and their silence, as indifferent as they have always been, and as beautiful as they have always been. these two qualities perhaps not as separate as they first appear. He goes back inside. He sits down beside the lamp. He picks up the pen. Tomorrow there will be reports and marching orders and the 100 practical necessities of a campaign on the edge of the empire's reach, and he will attend to all of them as well as he can. But for now there is only the flame and the page and the quiet that gathers in a tent at the end of a long day's journey, and this is enough, more than enough, for the hours that remain before sleep. And somewhere not far away, in the warmth and order of the campaign tent that has become his second home, a slow day is already taking shape in the lamplight, a day that will begin before dawn and end in that same steady flame, unhurried and full and worth following. The darkness before dawn on the Danube frontier is a particular kind of darkness, dense and unmoving, pressing in against the leather walls of the tent as though the night itself has weight, as though the world beyond the camp boundary has ceased to exist entirely, and there is nothing left in all creation but this small warm circle of oil lamplight, this low flame trembling at the wick's edge, this single point of amber warmth held against the vast and indifferent cold of the northern dark. He is already awake. He has been awake for some time, lying still beneath the heavy wool blankets that smell faintly of lanolin and river damp, listening to the sounds that reach him through the tent walls, the low exchange of voices between sentries at the perimeter, the soft percussion of a horse shifting its weight somewhere in the camp lines, the distant movement of the Danube itself, that perpetual murmur and push of cold water over stone, carrying its endless cargo of darkness southward toward a sea he has not seen in years. Marcus does not rise immediately. The Stoic practice of the morning, as he has come to understand it, does not demand urgency. It demands attention, and so he lies a moment longer, gathering himself the way one gathers a cloak against the cold, deliberately, with care, pulling the fabric of consciousness close around the day that has not yet truly begun. When he does rise, the movement is slow and considered. He is past his 50th year now, and the body announces this fact each morning with a careful inventory of its complaints, the ache in the chest that has been with him for some seasons, the stiffness in the joints that the Danube cold makes worse, the persistent fatigue that no amount of sleep seems entirely to resolve. He has written about this in his private pages, that one must not indulge the body's desire to remain horizontal, that the bed is a kind of argument the flesh makes against the day, and that the answer to that argument is simply to rise. And so he rises, his breath misting in the cold air of the tent's interior, reaching for the simple woolen tunic that his attendant has left folded and waiting on the campaign chest nearby. The lamp is already burning. Someone has seen to it, one of the small, faithful acts of care that surround a man in his position without his asking, the invisible labor of servants and freedmen who anticipate his needs with a quiet efficiency he has long since learned to accept with gratitude rather than take as his due. The flame is low and steady, sheltered from any draught, casting its warm circle across the writing table with its familiar clutter, the wooden tablets stacked to one side, the ink pot with its sealed cloth cover, the small roll of papyrus weighted at its edge by a smooth river stone he picked up himself from the bank some weeks ago, simply because it pleased him to hold it. He does not immediately begin to write. First there is the morning practice of the mind, the slow interior recitation that Epictetus knew and that Marcus has made his own, a turning of attention toward the day ahead, an anticipation not of what he hopes to accomplish but of what he may encounter, difficulty, tedium, the frustration of other men's failures, the weight of decisions that will require everything he can give, and perhaps more. He stands near the lamp with his eyes half closed, his hands loose at his sides, and he thinks, "Today I will meet impatience, and I will not be swept away by it. Today I will meet grief, perhaps, or disappointment, and I will remember that these things are not the last word on anything." The lamp flame bends very slightly in some current of air too gentle to feel on the skin, then steadies again. By the time the camp begins to wake in earnest, the gradual crescendo of men's voices, the clang of cooking vessels, the low calls of officers beginning their rounds, Marcus has already been at the writing table for the better part of an hour. He writes in Greek, as he always has for the private pages, the language that feels to him like the truest medium for this particular kind of thought, as though the Roman tongue, for all its precision in law and administration, is somehow too public for what he is attempting here. What he writes this morning is not grand. It is not meant for any reader. It is a man talking to himself with the same quiet insistence a river has in wearing its stone. Not violent, not dramatic, simply persistent, always returning, always pressing gently at the same place. He writes about distraction. He writes about the way the mind, even a trained mind, even a mind that has spent decades in the company of philosophy, still drifts toward complaint and toward calculation of small personal grievances. He writes, "You have had this thought before, and you will need to have it again, and having to have it again is not a failure. It is simply what it means to be a creature who forgets." The ink dries on the page and the lamp burns, and outside the camp grows louder with the particular industry of an army preparing for another day at the edge of the known world. Then the correspondence begins. This is the other Marcus, the one who emerges from the private pages and steps into the machinery of empire, precise, efficient, measured in his judgments, careful with language in a different way. Dispatches arrive from Rome, carried by relay riders who have crossed the Alps and the long roads north in a matter of days, bearing the papyrus wrapped news of the Senate's deliberations, of civic matters requiring the emperor's attention, of floods in the Tiber Valley and disputes in distant provinces, and the thousand small bureaucratic necessities that do not pause simply because the emperor is standing in a campaign tent with cold feet watching the Danube. He reads each document with full attention, making notes in the margin with a stylus, dictating responses to the secretary who sits just inside the tent's entrance, with his wax tablet at the ready. There is no irritation in him today, at least not outwardly. The patience he has cultivated over 50 years sits on him like a well-worn garment, comfortable and second nature, though he knows, and has written as much, that it is never truly automatic, never truly effortless, that the composure visible on the surface is the result of constant invisible labor underneath. He thanks a general for his report. He responds to the Senate with care and with courtesy. He drafts a brief note to his daughter in Rome, full of quiet affection, asking after her health and the health of her children, signing it in his own hand. The midday meal is simple: bread, olive oil brought from somewhere south, a portion of whatever the camp kitchen has prepared, eaten at the table without ceremony, while a junior officer reads aloud from the afternoon's intelligence reports. The tent smells of lamp oil and leather and the faint mineral cold of the river, which reaches even here, even into this most interior space, threading itself through every crack and seam in the tent walls like a quiet reminder that the natural world has no interest in the affairs of empires, and asks only to be acknowledged. In the afternoon he moves through the camp on foot, as he prefers, accompanied by a small retinue whose presence he tolerates with good grace, though he has never entirely lost the inclination towards solitude that was in him from boyhood. He speaks to the soldiers he passes, not often but deliberately, pausing here and there to address a man by name if he knows it, to ask after an injury he recalls from a previous encounter, to stand for a moment beside a fire and let the warmth reach his hands. The soldiers watch him with a particular kind of regard that is not quite reverence and not quite familiarity, but something carefully between. A recognition, perhaps, that this is a man who shares their cold, their distance from home, their long patience on this wet and gray frontier, and who does not pretend otherwise. The evening comes early here. Darkness falls on the Danube with a kind of authority it does not have further south, as though the night is closer to the earth in this latitude, more confident in its claim. The lamp is lit again in the tent, that same small flame, and Marcus returns to the writing table with what remains of a cup of thin wine, cooling at his elbow. He opens the pages where he left them in the morning, and reads back over what he wrote in the pre-dawn stillness, reading it with the same careful, unsentimental eye he brings to everything. Not proud, not dismissive, simply attending. He adds a line, then another. Outside, the river moves in the dark as it has always moved, and will continue to move long after all of this. The tent, the lamp, the army, the man himself, has dissolved entirely into the past. But for now the flame holds, the ink is wet, and the night lies quietly ahead, full of rest for those who can find it. Tomorrow the frontier will still be there, and with it all its demands, but that is tomorrow, and this moment, with its warmth and its lamp, and its slow-moving thoughts, belongs entirely to the present, which is, as he has written many times in these pages, the only place any of us have ever truly lived. The snow came quietly to Vindobona that winter, the way snow always comes to places that have already grown accustomed to suffering, not with fury, not with any dramatic announcement, but simply settling over the rooftops of the timber barracks, and the earthen ramparts, and the broad backs of the sentries at their posts, as though it always meant to be there, as though it were merely returning to somewhere it had been before. The Danube, that great gray presence that had accompanied Marcus Aurelius through so many years of this final chapter of his life, ran dark and slow beneath its margins of ice, and the sound of it, that patient, ceaseless murmuring, reached even into the warmest rooms of the camp, drifting through the gaps in the wooden walls like a whispered reminder that the world continued on, indifferent and unhurried, whatever a man might feel or suffer within it. Marcus was in his 61st year now, which was not so very old for a man of ordinary life, but which felt, it is said, considerably older when measured in the currency of campaigns endured, losses absorbed, plagues survived, and winters spent far from the city where he had been born. His body had been making its complaints known for some time, a persistent weakness in the chest, a fatigue that sleep did not always remedy, a reluctance in the limbs that had no name, but which he recognized as something that would not, this time, be argued away. He had spent a great portion of his philosophical life instructing himself not to fear the body's decline, writing in those private pages that a man ought to hold his flesh lightly, as a traveler holds a bag that does not truly belong to him. Now those words were being tested in the most direct way possible, and those who attended him closely in those winter months observed that he bore the testing with a composure that seemed, even to men accustomed to his steadiness, remarkable. His quarters were modest in the way that his quarters had always been modest on campaign, a space that spoke of function rather than display, of a man who had never quite been able to take the ornamental dimensions of imperial power entirely seriously. There were lamps, of course, the small clay ones he had always preferred, their flames steady in the still interior air, casting that warm amber light across the writing table where his notebooks lay open, across the faces of the officers who came and went, across the maps and dispatches that continued to arrive from every corner of an empire that did not pause its business simply because the man charged with its care was unwell. There were letters to answer. There were always letters to answer. Decisions about the northern borders, about the tribes beyond the river, about the settlements and treaties that he hoped would bring some lasting quietude to this frontier he had spent so many years trying to secure. He answered them, it is said, with the same careful attention he had always brought to such things, though his secretaries noticed that he sometimes needed to rest between one document and the next, setting down his stylus and sitting very still for a time, his eyes directed toward nothing in particular. The officers who attended him in those weeks left accounts, some of which have survived in fragments, filtered through later writers, of a man who seemed, in a curious way, more present than diminished. He asked questions about the men under his command. He inquired after soldiers by name, which had always been a quality of his that struck those around him as unusual in a man of his position. He spoke thoughtfully about the arrangements being made, about what would follow, about the continuity of the campaigns he had set in motion, conducting the business of succession and military transition with the same patient thoroughness that had characterized his entire reign. He did not, by any account that has come down to us, give way to self-pity, nor did he perform the kind of theatrical resignation that the moment might have invited from a lesser man. He simply continued, in a somewhat slower and more effortful way, to be himself. In the evenings, when the formal business of the day had concluded and the lamps had been trimmed for the quieter hours, he returned to his private writing, the Meditations, that strange and intimate document that he had been composing for years across various frontiers and campaign sites, in Greek, for himself, with no apparent intention that anyone else should ever read it, lay beside him like a companion whose company he still found necessary. It is impossible to know with certainty what he wrote in those final weeks, since the notebooks do not come with dates attached to their entries, but those who study these things closely suggest that some of the passages in the final books carry the particular quality of a man who has moved past the abstract consideration of mortality into something more immediate and personal, a tone less of the philosopher speaking to himself in the third person and more of a man sitting quietly with what he knows. He wrote, in one passage whose timing scholars have long wondered over, about how a man ought to depart from life the way a ripe olive falls from the branch, with gratitude for the season that nourished it, and without resistance to the moment of release. Whether he wrote these words that winter, or years before, no one can say with certainty, but they carry somehow the feeling of a winter evening, of lamplight, of a river audible just beyond the wall. The soldiers in the camp knew their emperor was ill. Knowledge of that kind has a way of moving through a military settlement without anyone quite being able to explain how it travels, passing between watchfires, running along the lines at mealtimes, arriving in every barrack room as a kind of atmospheric certainty before any formal word is spoken. And the response of those soldiers, by the accounts we have, was a collective grief that surprised even those who witnessed it, a demonstration that the man they served had not been merely an abstraction to them, not merely the eagle on the standard or the face on the coin, but something more particular and more felt. It is said that men wept openly, which was not a thing that legionaries generally did, and that this weeping was not discouraged, which was itself a kind of testament to the quality of the man they mourned in anticipation. His family was not with him. Faustina, his wife of so many decades, had died some years before him, on a journey in Asia Minor, and the grief of that loss had stayed with him quietly, the way grief does when a man is too disciplined to let it surface fully into words. His son Commodus, who was now his designated heir, and who had been associated with him in the reign, was present at some point in those final weeks, though the accounts of their interactions are sparse, and carry a quality of constraint that suggests the relationship between father and son had never quite become what Marcus, with his vast capacity for hope on behalf of those he loved, had wished for it to be. He had done what he believed was right in preparing Commodus for rule. He had done as he had always done in everything, what he could with what was given to him. The river ran on outside the walls. The snow continued to fall, or not to fall, in the way that Danubian winter moves between its moods, sometimes still and white and almost peaceful, sometimes driving in on a wind from the northeast that made the sentries on the walls pull their cloaks tighter and think of places far to the south. Inside, the lamps held their small, steady flames against the dark, and Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor, soldier and student, the man who had spent a lifetime trying to be better than his circumstances required him to be, lay in the quiet that was gathering around him now, surrounded by the muffled sounds of a military camp carrying on its business, the occasional distant call of a watch trumpet, the creak of timber in the cold, and beneath all of it, always, the low and patient voice of the river. He died, the sources tell us, in March of the year 180, near Vindobona, the city that would, in much later centuries, become Vienna. He had held the empire for nearly 19 years. He was, by every account we possess, ready, in the sense that a man who has thought very carefully about readiness can be said to have arrived at it. And the lamps in the camp that evening burned as they always burned, small, warm, quietly present, while outside the Danube moved on toward its distant sea, carrying with it, as rivers carry everything, the reflection of whatever light the night had left to offer. What came after his death, what the world made of the man he had been, what his son made of the throne he had tried so carefully to prepare for, and what those private notebooks eventually meant to the centuries that followed, belongs to the chapter that waits gently for you just ahead, ready whenever you are ready, unhurried as the river itself. The river did not stop when he died. That is perhaps the simplest and most honest thing to say about what followed. The Danube moved as it had always moved, gray and indifferent and vast, carrying its cold water westward through the reeds and the frozen mud of early spring, past the camp walls at Vindobona, where the lamps had burned low through his final nights, past the places where his legions had crossed on pontoon bridges in the long years of the German wars, past all the small fires his soldiers had lit against the darkness of the northern frontier. The river had no memory of emperors. It would carry the same water past the same banks long after every man who had ever stood on its shore and looked north with anxious eyes had turned to ash and silence. What the river could not carry away, however, were words, and it is with words that the story of what Marcus Aurelius left behind truly begins. In the weeks and months after his death, in that late winter of 180 years after the birth of Christ, the machinery of the Roman Empire moved with the practiced efficiency of something that had long since learned to absorb the loss of any single man, even an emperor. The legions gave their loyalty to his son, Commodus, who had been at his father's side on the frontier, and who received the news of his succession with what the sources describe as a kind of relief. Relief, it is said, that he might now return to Rome, to the warmth and pleasure and spectacle of the city his father had loved in a quieter and more measured way. The succession was smooth in the narrow political sense. There was no civil war, no scramble between generals, none of the catastrophe that had swallowed the year of the four emperors more than a century before. Marcus had spent years ensuring that the transfer of power would hold. What he could not ensure was what kind of man his son would become once the purple was fully his own. Commodus was, by most accounts that have come down to us, everything his father was not, and yet the contrast is so complete, so almost theatrical in its neatness, that we should hold it gently, and remember that history is sometimes tidied after the fact by writers who prefer clean lessons. It is said that Commodus cared little for the grave business of philosophy, less still for the long correspondence and careful administration that had filled his father's days, and least of all for the frontier, which he abandoned with considerable speed after concluding a peace that many of his father's officers found premature. He returned to Rome and settled into a reign that would last 12 years, growing stranger and more unstable as those years accumulated, until the men around him, the palace staff, the praetorian officers, even his own household, decided quietly that he could no longer be permitted to continue. And in the last days of 192, he was strangled by a wrestler named Narcissus while lying in his bath. It is a death that has a grim sort of Roman completeness to it, and one can only note, with the careful neutrality Marcus himself would have recommended, that the empire survived it, as it survived so much. The dynasty that Marcus had inherited and tended and passed on did not survive much longer. The Antonine line, which had produced Antoninus Pius and Marcus himself, and which had given the empire nearly a century of relative stability, effectively ended with Commodus. What followed was a period of disruption and civil war that would have distressed Marcus deeply had he lived to see it, though he had perhaps always known in some quiet interior room of his thinking that the good order of things was fragile, that it required constant attention, that no single good emperor could make the world permanently better, only tend it carefully for the years allotted to him. This, after all, was very nearly a Stoic catechism. Do what you can with what you have, for as long as you are given, let the rest go. And so it is worth pausing here in the long echoing corridor of history that stretches out from Marcus's death to consider what it actually was that he left behind, because it was not, in the end, political stability, nor a dynasty, nor even the particular shape of the empire's borders, all of which were subject to the usual erosions of time. What he left behind was something considerably harder to destroy. The small bound pages of the Meditations, or whatever physical form his private Greek notes took in his own lifetime, began slowly to be known. We do not know with any precision how they were preserved in the immediate years after his death, how they passed from the campaign tent to some library or archive, who read them first in those early decades and thought them worth keeping. The story of how manuscripts survive through centuries is always partly a story of quiet luck, of the right person finding the right codex in the right scriptorium at the right moment, of monks copying by candlelight in medieval monasteries without fully knowing what they held, of scholars rediscovering texts that had been sleeping for generations in the dust of some great house's collection. The Meditations traveled through all of this. The first printed edition appeared in 1559, more than 1,300 years after Marcus's death, set in type in Zurich, and from that moment something that had been a quiet trickle began very gradually to widen into something larger. What readers found in those pages, across century after century, was not the voice of an emperor, or not only that. They found the voice of a man talking to himself, honestly and without performance, in the small hours of the night, by lamplight, about the difficulty of being good. They found someone who was not certain he was succeeding. They found someone who had to remind himself repeatedly that other people were doing their best, that anger was a waste of the short time allotted to any life, that the body was temporary, and the present moment was all that could actually be possessed. They found someone who was afraid of losing himself in distraction and luxury and flattery, and who built small verbal fences against those things every time he set pen to page. The remarkable thing was not that a philosopher had written these thoughts. It was that an emperor had written them, a man who had every opportunity to lose himself in comfort, who had armies and treasure and the adulation of millions, and who nonetheless sat down night after night and reminded himself to be better. Centuries passed, empires rose and dissolved. The Western Roman Empire that Marcus had administered with such exhausted care fragmented and transformed itself into something unrecognizable over the course of the 300s and 400s, the great institutions becoming memory, becoming legend. The eastern half lingered longer, changing slowly, until it too passed away in the 1400s. And still the meditations moved quietly forward through time, copied and translated and read by men and women who had never stood on the banks of the Danube, who had never seen the smoke rising from a Roman funeral pyre, who had never felt the weight of a toga or smelled the particular smell of a Roman city in summer, but who recognized something in those pages that felt close and present and true. The 20th century found Marcus Aurelius in places he could never have imagined. His words appeared in the letters of soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, it is said, carried in jacket pockets through mud that would perhaps have seemed familiar to a man who had known the riverbank camps of Germania. His words appeared in the libraries of presidents and generals and prison inmates, and ordinary people who had stumbled on a little book in the section marked Philosophy, and found, to their surprise, that a man who had died in 180 felt astonishingly near. There is something about the voice of the Meditations that resists the usual distances of historical time, the archaic language, the cultural foreignness, the vast gulf of centuries. It finds a way through. What Marcus Aurelius left behind, then, was not the empire he had guarded, which was going to change regardless, and not the dynasty he had tried to secure, which dissolved in his son's unfortunate hands, and not even the particular philosophical system he practiced, though Stoicism itself has had its own long and interesting journey through time. What he left behind was a quality of attention, the careful, honest, self-questioning attention of a person trying very hard to do right by the world they had been placed in, preserved in words that turned out to be strong enough to last. And tonight, those words are still here, as quiet and as patient as the river that kept moving after he died, carrying whatever light it catches on its surface through the long dark, all the way to the sea. Tomorrow, in the last chapter of our journey together, we will gather all of this slowly in, the lamplight and the dust, the faces and the voices, the river and the stars above the Danube camp, and we will lay it all down gently, as one lays down something that has been carried a long way and has been, in the carrying, a kind of gift. For now, let that thought rest with you, like warmth after a long walk. The river is still tonight, somewhere beyond the walls of wherever you are lying. The world continues its turning, its traffic and its wind, its distant conversations, its 10,000 small necessities. But here, in this quiet space between waking and sleep, there is only the river and the lamp and the long, unhurried procession of a life that ended nearly 2,000 years ago, and somehow has not ended at all. Let us gather it together now, slowly, the way you might gather the last warmth from a fire before you let it go for the night. Let us move through it all once more, not with urgency, but with the gentle attention of someone who has walked a long road and pauses finally to look back at the distance covered. It began on the 7 hills, in a city that smelled of bread and river mud and the smoke of 10,000 lamps lit at dusk. Rome in the 2nd century of the Common Era was a place of extraordinary accumulation, of people, of languages, of marble and ambition and noise, and yet underneath all of that noise there was a rhythm, slow and ancient, like a heartbeat. The sun rose over the Palatine and turned the stone warm and golden. The sun set over the Tiber and sent long shadows between the columns. And somewhere in a house of prosperous and senatorial dignity, in the year 121, a boy was born who would spend his entire life trying to be worthy of the world that had made him. His name in those early years was Marcus Annius Verus, and he was a quiet child. This much the stories agree upon. He lost his father very young, and so the texture of his childhood was shaped by women and by grandfathers, by the gentle governance of people who loved him, without requiring him to be other than he was. He played in courtyards, where the light came down in rectangles through open roofs. He listened to the sound of sandals on stone, the splash of water in basins, the low conversation of a household, going about its days. He was, by all accounts, a child who noticed things, who sat with stillness more natural than restlessness, and who found in that stillness something that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Then came the tutors, one after another, each carrying a lamp of their own. There was the painted writing and the careful rhetoric, the Stoic philosophy that arrived like a gift he had not known to ask for. It is said that the philosopher Junius Rusticus placed a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus in the young Marcus's hands, and that from that moment something settled in him, some orientation toward the true north of his own character. The Stoics taught that the world outside was largely beyond your governance, but that the world inside, the small, sovereign republic of your own thoughts and responses, that was yours to tend, like a lamp that must be trimmed and fed and protected from the wind. And then Hadrian saw him, the old emperor, already unwell, already looking toward the horizon of his own ending, noticed the boy at a family gathering, noticed his gravity, his calm, his quality of attention, and was moved to set in motion something extraordinary. Through the mechanism of adoption, through the patient maneuvering of succession, Marcus Annius Verus was carried by degrees toward a destiny he had not sought, and by his own later account did not particularly desire. Antoninus Pius became his father in every way that mattered, and for 20 years, in the quiet apprenticeship of a patient man, learning from a steadier one, Marcus watched and assisted and waited, growing slowly into whatever he was going to be. The villa at Lorium held some of the best of those years, its garden paths in the early morning, its fig trees and the sound of birds before anyone else was fully awake, its long afternoons of reading in the shade of a colonnade, while the heat lay heavy on the countryside beyond the walls. And Rome itself offered its own particular textures of interior life, the tablinum where correspondence piled like autumn leaves, the peristyle where you could hear water if you sat quietly enough, the lamp on the table that burned into the small hours when a restless mind would not consent to sleep. He became emperor in 161 upon the death of Antoninus, and he shares that moment with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, in an unprecedented sharing of the purple that suggests everything you need to know about Marcus's character, that power, to him, was always something to be distributed rather than hoarded, lightened rather than magnified. But the wake came regardless. Plague moved through the empire like a slow tide, touching everything, taking people in numbers that staggered the imagination. War gathered on the eastern horizon and then on the northern one, and Marcus, who had wanted above all things to be a philosopher, found himself instead a soldier emperor, drafting correspondence by lamplight, in tents that smelled of damp wool and pine smoke, listening to the river. The Danube, always in those later years, the Danube, gray and cold and indifferent, moving north between its banks with the same unhurried authority it had maintained for 10,000 years before Rome existed, and would maintain for 10,000 years after. The soldiers built their fires against the winter, and huddled in their cloaks, and Marcus stood sometimes at the edge of the camp, and looked out across the water toward the darkness on the other side. And what he thought in those moments is not recorded, but what he wrote is, the Meditations, written for no one, addressed to himself, never intended to be read by any eye but his own, book after book of private reckoning, of self-correction, of reminders so gentle and so honest that they feel even now like watching someone speak to themselves in a mirror with unusual kindness. He wrote, "The obstacle is the way." He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote, "Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, malicious people, and then go out and meet them anyway, with patience, because they are also human, also struggling, also doing their imperfect best." The wax pooled and hardened and was replaced. The words accumulated, quiet as snowfall, personal as prayer. Lucius died on a road in the north, and Marcus mourned him and carried on. Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor in the east, and Marcus responded not with fury, but with the patient certainty of a man who has made a long study of the difference between things that matter and things that merely feel as though they do. The revolt dissolved. Marcus continued. His children, so many of them and so many of them gone before him, lost to the ordinary cruelties of a world without medicine enough for its own tenderness. His children were a grief he wore quietly, the way you wear something that never quite leaves you, but that you have learned to carry without letting it govern every step. And Faustina, married for nearly 30 years, she traveled with him to the edges of the world, to the Syrian east and the Danubian north. And when she died in 175, in the foothills near a small village, something in Marcus's life closed like a door. He mourned her simply, publicly, without drama, in the Stoic way, which is not to say without feeling, but rather with feeling fully acknowledged and then gently, with great effort, released. The last winter came to him near Vindobona, where the river bends and the cold comes early and stays long. He was 58 years old, which was not young for a man who had spent years on campaign in northern climates, with a constitution never built for hardship. His body was failing him in the methodical, irreversible way that bodies eventually fail everyone, and he knew it with the clarity of someone who had been preparing for this particular knowledge for his entire adult life. The lamp burned on the table beside his cot. Outside, the river moved. His officers came and went. Somewhere in the camp, a soldier was singing something low and half-remembered, a song from a city 1,000 miles south, where the light was different, and the winters did not press so close. He died in March of 180, and the legions mourned him in the genuine way, not the performed mourning of political obligation, but the real thing, the grief that moves through a crowd like a change in weather, visible in posture and in silence. And then the lamp passed on, not to Commodus, who received the empire and did with it what careless hands do with delicate things. The lamp passed instead through the centuries in a different way, through copying and recopying of those private pages, through Arabic translation and Byzantine preservation and Renaissance rediscovery, through Gregory Hayes's clear modern rendering and 1,000 reading lights in 1,000 rooms across 2,000 years of human beings, looking for something steady to hold in the dark. The lamp is still burning now, in whatever form it reaches you tonight, in this voice, in this story, in the simple fact that you have spent these hours in the company of a man who believed above all things that it was possible to be better than you were yesterday, kinder than the world required you to be, more patient than the moment demanded, more honest with yourself than was comfortable. He did not always succeed. He said so himself, in his own hand on the pages he never meant for you to read. But he kept trying, night after night, by lamplight, on the banks of a cold river, with the stars indifferent above him and the morning still hours away. Rest now. Let the images settle like silt to the bottom of still water. The 7 hills at dusk, the boy in the courtyard, the philosopher reading by a lamp, the soldier emperor on the frozen bank of the Danube, the private pages filled with honest striving, the river moving north in the dark. The lamp has burned long enough for tonight. Let it glow low and warm and gentle and carry you into sleep.